Hey friend, before we start tonight, if these stories have become part of how you fall asleep, a like or a subscribe means more than you'd think. Not for numbers, but because it tells me you'll be here again the next time you need this. And some nights, just knowing that someone out there will be waiting makes all the difference. While you're here, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Someone in a quiet house outside London. Someone in Toronto with the lights already off. I read every comment. It matters to me, knowing who's out there with me. All right, let's get you settled. Dim the lights. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop. Your jaw unclench. The day go. Comfortable? Good. Let's go. It is not yet 5 a.m, and the kitchen garden at Ashcombe Park is the only part of the estate that is fully awake. Not the house. The house is dark, all 41 rooms of it. The tall sash windows black and blank under a sky that has only just begun to soften from ink to the palest grey at its eastern edge. But the kitchen garden, walled in old red brick that still holds the day's warmth from yesterday, has been awake for perhaps 20 minutes already. And the person responsible for that is a 19-year-old under-gardener named Thomas, who is currently on his knees in the dew, cutting lettuces with a small knife before the sun has any chance to wilt them. Here is a detail that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Victorian kitchen gardens like this one did not simply grow vegetables. They grew, quite literally, entire climates. Along the south-facing wall behind Thomas, there are peach trees trained flat against the brick in a fan shape, a technique called espalier, and the brick itself has been built with small gaps and flues running through it, so that in the cooler months fires can be lit at the base, and the heat drawn up through the wall like a radiator, warming the fruit that grows against it. A kitchen garden wall was in effect a very slow, very expensive heating system for peaches. Nobody eating a peach at the breakfast table upstairs in 3 hours will think about the brick, or the flue, or the fire that might have been lit in it back in April, to protect the blossom from a late frost. They will simply eat the peach. Thomas moves down the row. Behind him, a boy of perhaps 12, the garden boy, is already trundling a wheelbarrow of cut asparagus toward the potting shed, the spears still beaded with water, wrapped in damp cloth to keep them from wilting on the short walk to the kitchen door. Neither of them speaks much. There is no need. This has been the rhythm of every summer morning here for longer than either of them has been alive, and it will be the rhythm again tomorrow. A half-mile away on the other side of the house, in the long, low range of buildings that make up the stable block, a very different kind of morning is already well underway, and it smells nothing like the garden. It smells of hay and leather, and the particular warm, slightly sweet scent of horse, and underneath all of it, the sharper tang of the harness room where saddle soap sits in a tin softened overnight. The head coachman, a heavy-set man named Barrett who has worked at Ashcombe for 26 years, is already moving down the line of stalls, and here is something that tends to catch people off guard. In a household of this size, the horses are in a very real sense wealthier than most of the human beings who will ever set foot on the estate. There are 11 of them in this stable, and between them they will consume more in oats, hay, and veterinary attention over the course of a year than the wages of 3 housemaids combined. A good carriage horse, well matched to its pair, properly trained to stand quietly while a footman opens a door, cost more in 1875 than most working families would see in 2 years of combined income. Barrett does not think of this as strange. He has never known anything else. He simply runs his hand down the foreleg of a bay gelding, checking for heat, for swelling, for anything that might mean the horse cannot be put to the carriage today, because today, as it happens, matters. There are guests arriving this afternoon, and there will be a garden party by 4, and every single animal in this stable needs to look by 4 o'clock, as though it has never done a hard day's work in its life. Back inside the house itself, 3 floors below the sleeping family and half a floor below even the kitchen, there is a room with no windows at all, lit by a single oil lamp turned low, and in it a scullery maid named Peggy, who is 15 years old and has been awake since 4:30, is on her knees in front of the kitchen range with a tin of black lead and a brush, working the polish into the iron in slow, even strokes. This is a job most people today have simply never heard of, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says so much about what an ordinary morning actually cost in labour. The great cast iron kitchen range, The enormous black stove that will, in a few hours, be roasting, boiling, baking and warming water for an entire household, has to be black-leaded, meaning coated in a graphite-based polish, almost every single day, because the iron rusts if it is not. And a rusted range does not hold heat evenly and looks, to any visiting housekeeper's eye, like a sign of a poorly run kitchen. Peggy will be at this for the better part of an hour before the range is lit. Her hands, by the time she finishes, will be black to the wrist, and she will scrub them raw at the scullery sink before she's permitted to touch a single item of food. Nobody upstairs will ever see this. That is, in some ways, the entire point of it. Let me take you somewhere else for a moment, because the morning at Ashcombe does not happen in only one place. It happens in a dozen places at once, all of them running on slightly different clocks, all of them converging, eventually, on the same 9 o'clock breakfast gong. Up in the housekeeper's room, which sits at the heart of the servants' quarters like a small, orderly kingdom, Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, is already dressed, in black bombazine despite the warmth of the July morning, her keys, some 30 of them, hanging from a chatelaine at her waist. And here is a fact that genuinely surprises people. Those keys are not decorative. Mrs. Hartley controls, quite literally, every locked cupboard in the house that contains anything of value. The tea caddy, the sugar, the store cupboard with its preserved fruits and its French wines, the linen presses with their monogrammed sheets, even, in some households, the household supply of soap. Tea, in particular, was kept under lock and key well into the Victorian period, a holdover from decades earlier when it had been taxed so heavily that it was worth more, ounce for ounce, than some spices, and old habits, once built into the architecture of a house, do not disappear just because the tax has. She unlocks the store cupboard now, checking the morning's requirements against a list written in her own careful hand the night before, and dispatches the still-room maid to fetch what is needed for the day's preserving. Because July, in a house like this, is jam season, and there will be gooseberries to deal with before the heat of the afternoon spoils them. Meanwhile, in the laundry, which sits in its own separate building entirely, away from the main house, both for reasons of smell and reasons of fire risk, 2 laundry maids are already sorting yesterday's washing into piles. White separated from coloureds, delicate separated from sturdy, because Monday, in this house, as in nearly every house of its era and class, is wash day, and wash day begins before the family has even rung for their morning tea. And upstairs, in the night nursery, tucked away on the second floor where the children of the house sleep under the care of their nurse, a very small girl of 4, whose name is Cecily, is standing at the window in her nightgown, watching a gardener she cannot possibly identify from this distance push a wheelbarrow across the lawn, and wondering, the way small children do, what it would be like to have his job instead of hers. Her nurse, dozing in the chair by the empty grate, has not yet noticed she's awake. This is the household at Ashcombe Park in the hour before dawn has fully arrived, in the middle of July, in a summer that will turn out to be one of the warmest anyone can remember. Upstairs, in the principal bedrooms along the south front of the house, the family itself is still asleep, and will remain so for a while yet, because in a house like this, waking early is, paradoxically, a privilege reserved almost entirely for the people who do not have to. The woman whose day we are going to follow tonight is the lady of this house. Her name is Evelina Ashworth, though almost nobody living calls her that. To her husband she's simply Eve, in the rare moments they are alone. To her servants she is my lady, or Lady Ashworth, always, without exception, whatever the hour. To her children she is Mama in the nursery and something more formal, almost ceremonial, in front of guests. She's 34 years old this summer. She's been married for 11 years, has 3 living children, and one who did not survive infancy, a fact she has never once discussed with anyone outside her own bedroom, and possibly, on her very worst nights, not even then. She manages a household of 18 indoor servants and rather more outdoor staff, a social calendar that would exhaust a diplomat, a husband who loves her in the somewhat distracted way of a man who has never had to think very hard about what love requires in daily practice, and a summer that is about to bring, within the space of 6 hours, a garden party, a difficult letter, an old rival, and a piece of news she has not yet told a single living soul. We will get to all of it. But first, like every morning at Ashcombe, we have to begin with the getting up. Evelina wakes, as she always does, without an alarm, because her body has spent 11 years learning the exact shape of this house's morning, and now performs it automatically, the way a hand finds a familiar doorknob in the dark. It is 6:20. The light coming through the gap in the curtains is already warm, already promising a hot day, and for a moment she simply lies there, looking at the ceiling, at the plasterwork rows around the light fitting that she has looked at every morning for over a decade and never once really seen. Her lady's maid, a woman named Sarah Pruitt, who has been with her for 9 years now and knows the exact temperature Evelina prefers her wash water, the exact tension she likes in her hair, the exact 3 seconds of silence she needs before being spoken to in the morning, appears at 6:30 without being rung for. This is itself a small point of pride between them. A good lady's maid does not wait to be summoned, she simply knows. The first hour of Evelina's day, if you added up every individual task that goes into it, would look less like getting dressed and more like the choreography of a small, very precise military operation. And I want to walk you through it slowly, because it is one of those things that sounds simple from the outside and turns out to be almost absurdly complex once you actually look at it. First, the washing. At the marble-topped washstand in the corner, water carried up in copper cans by a housemaid 20 minutes earlier and kept warm under a folded towel. Then the underlinen, which for a woman of Evelina's class in this decade means, in order, a camise of fine lawn cotton, drawers and stockings held up with garters just above the knee, because elastic stocking tops have not yet become common, and will not for some decades yet. And then comes the corset, and here I want to slow down, because this is a subject people have a lot of opinions about, usually formed from costume dramas rather than from anything historically accurate, and the reality is both less dramatic and in its own way more interesting. Evelina's corset is not, contrary to popular imagination, laced to some cartoonish, waist-crushing extreme every single morning. It is boned with whalebone, or occasionally the cheaper alternative of steel, and it is laced firmly, snugly, in a way that shapes the torso into the fashionable silhouette of the period, a long, smooth line from bust to hip, with very little natural give at the waist. Sarah laces it from the back, working the cord through the eyelets in a crossing pattern, pulling gradually, checking in with a small habitual glance rather than a spoken question, because after 9 years she can read the set of Evelina's shoulders well enough to know when to stop. Here is the detail that surprises people most. In July, in a house with no reliable way to cool a room beyond open windows and drawn blinds, wearing a fully boned corset, a camise, drawers, stockings, and on top of all of that a heavy layered day dress, was genuinely, physically uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the sheer non-negotiable weight of Victorian femininity, Evelina will sweat today. She will feel the boning press against her ribs by mid-afternoon in a way that grows, hour by hour, from mild pressure into something closer to a dull, persistent ache, and she will do absolutely nothing about it, because the alternative, appearing in public without the correct foundational garments, without the correct silhouette, is not merely a matter of comfort, it is a matter of visible moral seriousness. A woman who is loosely laced, who allows her figure to soften and slump in company, is understood instantly and without a word being said to be a woman who has let herself go in some deeper sense, who lacks the discipline that respectability requires. The corset is not simply clothing, it is a kind of posture worn on the outside that signals a posture on the inside. There is a specific medical detail worth mentioning here, because it genuinely was not fully understood at the time. Doctors of the era debated the corset endlessly, some warning of damage to internal organs, others insisting it provided necessary support to a female frame they believed was inherently weaker than a man's. What we know now looking back is that a properly fitted, moderately laced corset like Evelina's did compress the lower ribs and could, over years, actually reshape them slightly, and it did restrict deep breathing to the point where many Victorian women simply learned to breathe shallowly from the upper chest as their permanent default. Fainting, so common in the fiction of the period that it has become almost a joke, a fashionable joke actually, was frequently a straightforward consequence of restricted breathing combined with a hot room and a long-standing engagement. Nothing mystical about it at all, just simple physiology meeting fashionable clothing meeting an August garden party. Over the corset goes a corset cover, a light cotton layer to protect the outer dress from the boning and to smooth the line further. Then petticoats, 2 of them this morning since it is a day dress rather than full evening dress, one of plain cotton for structure and one trimmed with a little lace at the hem that will show if she lifts her skirt slightly to step over a puddle or a low step. And only then, finally, the dress itself, a morning dress of soft printed cotton in a small floral pattern, cut for comfort relative to what she will wear later in the day, though comfort here is a relative term that would strike most modern women as anything but. Sarah does the hooks up the back, some 30 of them, small and closely spaced, running from the nape of the neck to well below the waist, a task that takes several minutes and that Evelina could not physically manage alone even if she wanted to, which is worth sitting with for a second. A wealthy Victorian woman's clothing was, quite literally, engineered to require another person's hands. Independence, in the most basic physical sense of dressing oneself, was not really an option this dress offered. It was not designed to be put on alone. While Sarah works, Evelina reviews the day. Not aloud, but in the particular half-attentive way one does while being handled. And I mean handled almost literally, because this is a body being managed by another person's hands in a way that both women have long since stopped finding strange. There is the garden party at 4, for which the guest list runs to nearly 60 names, and about which 3 separate small crises have already presented themselves this week. There is a letter from her sister that arrived yesterday, and that she still has not properly answered. There is her husband's mother, who is coming to stay for a fortnight beginning tomorrow, an event Evelina has been quietly dreading since the invitation was first extended back in March. And there is the other thing, the thing she has not told anyone. She catches herself thinking about it and pushes the thought away, the way she has been pushing it away for nearly 2 weeks now, because there will be time for it later, there has to be, and right now there is hair to be done and a household to run before any of that can matter. Sarah moves to the hair next, and this too takes considerably longer than most people would guess. Evelina's hair is thick and a deep chestnut brown, reaching well past her shoulder blades, and the fashionable style of this particular summer calls for it swept back from the face, the front and sides waved slightly with heated tongs that Sarah keeps warming on a small spirit lamp on the dressing table, the back arranged into a low knot, and the whole structure anchored with perhaps 24 hairpins that Sarah places from memory, without needing to look at a diagram, the way a musician plays a piece she learnt so long ago she no longer consciously recalls the notes. It takes 40 minutes, start to finish, hair alone. Evelina sits through most of it reading her correspondence, which Sarah has already laid out on the dressing table in the order Evelina prefers. Most urgent nearest her right hand, because a well-trained lady's maid learns not only her mistress's hair but the entire architecture of her habits. And after 9 years together, there is very little left for either woman to explain to the other. By 20 to 8, Evelina is dressed, her hair is done, and she has read 4 of her 7 letters. She is, by any measure that would have made sense to a woman of her time and place, ready to begin her day. It has taken her, from the moment she opened her eyes, 1 hour and 20 minutes, almost none of which she performed with her own 2 hands. Breakfast at Ashcombe is served at 9, in the breakfast room rather than the grand dining room, a smaller, sunnier space at the eastern end of the house that catches the morning light through tall windows overlooking the rose garden. By the time Evelina comes down, her husband Charles is already there, standing at the sideboard in the particular unhurried way of a man for whom the morning holds no urgency whatsoever, surveying a row of silver-covered dishes that a footman named Albert has set out at precisely 5 to 9. Here is something worth knowing about Victorian country house breakfasts that tends to surprise people because it runs against the modern idea of breakfast as something light and quick. The sideboard this morning holds devilled kidneys, a dish of kedgeree left over in spirit from the fashion for Anglo-Indian food that swept upper-class British households throughout the century. Eggs prepared 3 different ways: cold ham, a whole cold tongue pressed and sliced thin, toast in a silver rack designed specifically to let steam escape so the bread stays crisp rather than going soft and damp, and a jar of marmalade that the still room maid put up herself back in February from Seville oranges brought in by the greengrocer's cart. The meal is by design a buffet rather than a served course, which is itself a small mercy for the servants, since it means nobody has to hover with a tray while the family decides what they want. Charles helps himself to kidneys and a slice of tongue. Evelina, whose appetite this particular morning is unsettled in a way she attributes to the heat and does not examine further, takes only toast and a boiled egg and a cup of tea poured by Albert from a silver pot that has stood on the sideboard's spirit warmer since the meal began. They do not talk much over breakfast, not from coldness but from habit, the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have shared 11 years of mornings and have already said most of what needs saying about most ordinary things. Charles reads the Times, which arrived by the early post train and was pressed by a housemaid before it reached the breakfast room, a small detail that always makes Evelina smile slightly when she thinks about it, the idea of ironing a newspaper, though the practical reason is sound enough. Ironing sets the ink and keeps it from transferring to white gloves or cuffs. He mentions, without looking up, that he has had a letter from his mother confirming her arrival tomorrow on the 2:15 train, and could Evelina see to having the carriage sent. Evelina says of course in the tone of a woman who has said of course to this particular request roughly 40 times over the past 11 years, and will say it 40 more before either of them is finished with this arrangement. After breakfast comes what Evelina privately thinks of, though she would never say it aloud, as the second job of her day, and this is the correspondence, which she deals with at her own small writing desk in the morning room, a room that is entirely hers in a way few spaces in this enormous house actually are. Let me tell you what an ordinary morning's letters look like for a woman in Evelina's position, because the volume alone tends to astonish people. There is a note from Lady Vane, an old acquaintance and, if we are honest, something closer to a rival, confirming her attendance at this afternoon's garden party, and mentioning, with what Evelina reads instantly as a small deliberate barb, that she has recently acquired a new landau carriage from the same maker Evelina used 2 years ago, only in a more current style. There is a request from the vicar's wife regarding the flower rota for Sunday's service. There is a letter from Evelina's own sister, Margaret, married to a clergyman in Shropshire and considerably less wealthy, containing news of a nephew's exam results and a gently worded, carefully non-demanding mention that the roof of the vicarage is leaking again, and repairs are, as ever, a stretch. There is a tradesman's account from the dressmaker in town regarding the fitting scheduled for Thursday. There is an invitation to a house party in Leicestershire in September that will require careful thought about whether accepting creates an obligation Evelina does not wish to create. And there is one more letter, from a name she does not recognise immediately, that she sets aside unopened at the bottom of the pile, though her eyes keep drifting back to it while she deals with the others. Answering all of this properly in the correct tone for each correspondent, with the correct degree of warmth or formality, takes the better part of 2 hours, and this is not incidental labour, it is a genuine skill, one that Victorian etiquette manuals discussed with real seriousness, because a woman's letters were, in a very real sense, her public voice, read aloud sometimes to other family members, kept sometimes for years, judged always for what they revealed about her taste, her education, her breeding, Evelina writes in a small, neat, upright hand that her governess spent years perfecting in her, and she chooses her words with the same care she would choose a dress for an important occasion, because in a sense that is exactly what a letter is. While she writes, the household around her continues its own separate, parallel mourning. And this is worth pausing on because it is one of the strangest and most defining features of a house like Ashcombe. Evelina and the butler, whose name is Grimshaw and who has served this family for over 20 years, might pass each other in a corridor 11 times in a single day and exchange perhaps 4 sentences total. And yet the entire smooth functioning of her life depends absolutely on decisions he is making constantly, decisions she will never see and rarely think about. Grimshaw this morning is dealing with the wine for tonight's dinner, since although it is only a garden party this afternoon, there will be a proper dinner this evening as well, for the handful of guests staying overnight, and he has gone down to the cellar himself, as he always does for anything involving the good bottles, to select what will be served, cross-referencing it in his memory against what was served the last time these particular guests dined at Ashcombe, because serving the same wine twice to the same important guest is, in his professional judgment, a small failure of attentiveness that reflects on the household as a whole. The relationship between Evelina and Grimshaw is one of the odder intimacies of upper-class Victorian life, because in one sense he knows almost everything about her husband's moods, her household's finances in broad strokes, which guests she genuinely likes and which she merely tolerates, and in another sense they maintain between them an almost total formality, a wall of correct address and correct distance that neither would ever think to breach. She has never once in 11 years asked him a personal question. He has never once offered an opinion she did not directly request. And yet if she rang for him at midnight with some crisis, he would appear within minutes fully dressed, entirely composed, because that composure, that permanent availability, is quite literally what he is paid to provide. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, occupies a slightly different position in this architecture, closer to Evelina in daily contact but no less formal in tone. It is Mrs. Hartley who comes to the morning room at 10:30, as she does every day at this hour, for what both women simply call the household conference, though it is really a short, business-like meeting in which the day's menus are confirmed, the linen requirements discussed, any staffing concerns raised in the careful, indirect language both women have long since perfected for discussing servants without appearing to gossip about them. This morning there is a small matter to address. One of the housemaids, a girl named Alice, has been unwell for 2 days, and Mrs. Hartley wants Evelina's approval to send for the doctor rather than simply dosing her with the household's standard remedies, because if it is something contagious, better to know now, before 60 guests arrive on the lawn this afternoon. Evelina approves this immediately and asks in the same breath and the same even tone whether the strawberries for this afternoon's tea have come in from the kitchen garden yet. This is the texture of her authority. Small and large concerns handled in the same register, a sick housemaid and a bowl of strawberries given, on the surface at least, exactly the same weight, because both in their own way are her responsibility, and a woman of her position does not have the luxury of deciding which parts of her household deserve her full attention. There is a 4th person whose mourning we have not yet visited, and she matters a great deal to what happens later today. Her name is Louisa, she is 19 years old, and she is Evelina's husband's niece, orphaned of her own mother some years back and taken in by the family, raised alongside her cousins as something between a daughter and a permanent, slightly formal guest. This summer is Louisa's 2nd season, meaning her 2nd year of formal eligibility in the marriage market that structures so much of upper-class Victorian social life. And it is, everyone in the household understands without ever quite saying so, a season with a certain quiet urgency to it, because a 2nd season without a serious attachment forming begins, ever so slightly, to raise eyebrows. Louisa is at her window this morning, in her own smaller bedroom 2 doors down from Evelina's, doing something she does most mornings and would be mortified for anyone to catch her at, which is rereading a letter she has already read perhaps a dozen times since it arrived 4 days ago. Let me explain the actual mechanics of Victorian courtship for a moment, because it is considerably more elaborate and considerably stranger than most people realize, and Louisa's situation sits right at the center of all of it. An unmarried young woman of Louisa's class was, by the standards of this period, almost never permitted to be alone in the company of an unrelated young man, under any circumstances, for any length of time, regardless of how innocent the intent. This was not merely a suggestion. It was one of the most rigid rules governing the entire structure of courtship, and it produced an entire supporting cast of chaperones, older married women, aunts, mothers, occasionally a trusted married cousin, whose job was simply to be present, in the room, at the picnic, in the carriage, anywhere a young man and a young woman might otherwise find themselves alone together. The reasoning behind this was explicitly about reputation rather than morality in any abstract sense, though the two were treated as functionally identical. A young woman who was seen to be alone with a man even for 10 minutes, even doing absolutely nothing untoward, could have her reputation damaged in ways that were extremely difficult to repair, because the assumption of impropriety, once raised, tended to stick regardless of the facts. And a damaged reputation was not simply a personal matter. It affected her marriageability directly, and by extension her entire future, since marriage was, for a young woman in Louisa's position, close to the only route available to economic security and social standing. This is why correspondence, actual letters, mattered so enormously, and why the letter currently in Louisa's hands represents something genuinely significant. An unmarried young woman corresponding directly with a man to whom she was not engaged was, itself, a fairly serious breach of etiquette, one that many households would not have tolerated at all. The proper channel, the channel Louisa is technically supposed to be using, involves letters passing through a parent or guardian, or being confined to strictly formal, almost ceremonial notes that could be read by anyone without embarrassment. The letter Louisa is holding is not that kind of letter. It is from a young man named Frederick Annesley, the second son of a family from 2 counties over, whom she met properly at a house party back in April, and has now met perhaps 6 times since, always officially in company, always with an aunt or a married cousin somewhere in the room or nearby on the lawn. And yet somehow in the space between those official meetings, a correspondence has begun, carried, if we are honest about it, by Louisa's own maid, a young woman named Ivy, who collects the letters from a gap behind a loose stone in the garden wall and delivers them with the tea things. A small, quiet conspiracy between 2 young women that neither would ever describe using that word, though that is precisely what it is. The letter is not improper in its content, not exactly. Frederick writes about a book he has been reading, about a horse he is thinking of buying, about the weather in a way that carries, underneath the ordinary words, something considerably warmer than the weather requires. But the very existence of the letter, the fact that it exists at all outside the sanctioned channels, is itself the thing that makes Louisa's hands slightly unsteady as she folds it back along its creases and tucks it beneath a false bottom in her writing box, a compartment Ivy helped her construct out of stiff card the previous autumn. If this were discovered, the consequences would not be trivial. At minimum, Ivy would very likely lose her position, since a lady's maid who assists in improper correspondence is a lady's maid who cannot be trusted, and trust is close to the entire basis of the relationship between a lady and her maid. At worst, for Louisa herself, discovery could mean the swift and permanent end of whatever is or is not developing with Frederick Annesley, because his family, and more importantly her uncle, would read the secrecy itself as evidence of a young woman with poor judgment, insufficient discretion, and questionable suitability as a wife. And yet Louisa continues, because Frederick Annesley is, as far as she can tell after 6 proper meetings and 4 improper letters, genuinely kind, genuinely funny in a dry, understated way she finds she likes considerably more than the louder charm of some of the other young men who have paid her attention this season. And because 19 is an age at which the risk of discovery, however real, tends to feel considerably smaller than the risk of doing nothing at all. She will see him this afternoon, in fact, at the garden party, since his family is among the 60 names on today's list, and the entire encounter will be conducted, as always, in company, in full view, with an aunt or a cousin never more than a few steps away, both of them performing polite, mild, entirely correct conversation about the weather and the croquet, while something else entirely passes underneath it in glances that last perhaps half a second too long. Evelina, for her part, knows almost nothing of this, though she has noticed, in the vague way an aunt notices things about a niece she loves but does not scrutinize too closely, that Louisa has seemed unusually preoccupied these past few weeks, a little flushed at odd moments, a little slower to answer when spoken to directly. She has attributed this, when she has thought about it at all, to the general nervous energy of a second season, and she is not entirely wrong, though she is missing the specific cause by a considerable margin. If she knew about the letters, she would be obligated to act, and this is worth understanding, because it explains why the secret matters so much and why Ivy risks so much in keeping it. Evelina stands, in this household, in the place of a mother to Louisa, and a mother's duty in matters of courtship was not a soft or optional thing. It meant vetting suitors, controlling access, managing the delicate machinery of introductions and permissions that determined in the end whether a young woman like Louisa married well, married adequately, or did not marry at all. Evelina takes this duty seriously, seriously enough that discovering an active secret correspondence would very likely mean Frederick Annesley's swift removal from any guest list this household ever produces again, whatever her private opinion of the young man himself might otherwise have been. So the letter stays hidden, the compartment stays closed, and downstairs the garden party guest list, already confirmed, already sent to the kitchen, to Grimshaw, to the stables for carriage arrangements, includes, entirely without anyone downstairs realizing its particular significance, the name of a young man whose presence this afternoon means considerably more to one member of this household than to any of the other 59 guests combined. Let us go back to that letter Evelina set aside this morning, from Lady Vane, the one mentioning the new landau carriage, because it is worth understanding properly what is actually happening underneath those few polite lines, since it tells you almost everything about how women in Evelina's position conducted their rivalries, which is to say almost never directly. Cecilia Vane and Evelina have known each other for 15 years, since they were girls together at the same small circuit of county balls, and their relationship has settled, over that decade and a half, into something that is not quite friendship, and not quite enmity, but a carefully maintained third thing that both women understand perfectly, and neither would ever describe honestly to a third party. They call each other dear, they exchange gifts at Christmas, they have sat beside each other at more dinners than either could count, and underneath every single one of those pleasant exchanges runs a current of comparison so constant, so automatic, that neither woman experiences it any more as competition exactly. It is simply the water they swim in. The carriage is a perfect example. 2 years ago, Evelina acquired a new landau, a fashionable open carriage suitable for warm weather outings, and Lady Vane admired it extensively at the time, in the particular effusive way that Evelina even then recognized as slightly too effusive to be entirely comfortable. Now 2 years later, Lady Vane has acquired her own in a newer style, and mentioned it in a letter ostensibly about a garden party, with a casualness so studied that Evelina read the actual message the instant she saw the sentence. The message is roughly this: I have noticed what you have, I have exceeded it, and I want you to know that I want you to know. This is how it works among women of this class, and it is worth understanding that it is not petty in the way it might sound, or rather it is petty, but the pettiness serves a genuine social function. A household's standing in this world is measured constantly, continuously, through exactly these small comparisons: carriages, dresses, the number of courses at a dinner, the quality of a garden, the success of a daughter's marriage, and a woman like Evelina cannot simply opt out of the comparison, because opting out reads, to everyone watching, as decline, as a household that either cannot keep pace or, worse, no longer cares to try. There is a third woman in this particular triangle, a Mrs. Bertram, newer to the county, married to a man who made his fortune in trade rather than inheriting it, and her position in this social ecosystem is more precarious and more interesting than either Evelina's or Lady Vane's, because new money, however substantial, does not automatically purchase the same social standing as old land, and Mrs. Bertram knows this better than anyone, which is why she overcompensates in ways that both Evelina and Lady Vane notice, discuss between themselves in the careful, indirect language reserved for this purpose, and privately, quietly, look down on, even while accepting her invitations and attending her considerably more lavish parties. Mrs. Bertram's garden last summer, for instance, featured an elaborate new glasshouse, larger and more technically impressive than anything at Ashcombe or at the Vane estate, and both women admired it in person with perfect sincerity while discussing it afterward in a carriage together on the way home, with a slightly cooler assessment that had less to do with the glasshouse itself and considerably more to do with what its expense and its newness seemed to say about a household still trying, in their view, a touch too hard. Evelina is not proud of this instinct in herself when she examines it honestly, which she does not do often. She genuinely likes Mrs. Bertram in many respects, finds her warmer and considerably less guarded than half the old families she has known her entire life, and yet the reflexive social calculation happens anyway, automatic and largely involuntary. The way a person raised in a particular language will always, on some level, keep counting in it even after decades abroad. The alliances shift too, and shift often, and this afternoon's garden party will be, among other things, a small stage on which several of these shifting alliances play out in miniature. Lady Vane and Mrs. Bertram have, this past month, formed an unusually close alliance around a shared project organising a charitable bazaar in aid of the county's cottage hospital, and Evelina, who was not invited to be part of the organising committee, has noticed this exclusion, felt the small sting of it, and said absolutely nothing, because saying something would be, in the delicate social grammar of this world, a far greater breach than the exclusion itself. One does not admit to noticing. One simply notices privately and adjusts one's own warmth accordingly at the next available opportunity, in ways so subtle that an outside observer would likely miss them entirely. There is a fourth woman worth mentioning, an older widow named Mrs. Fenwick, who occupies a curious and rather enviable position in this social world, precisely because she has, in widowhood, stopped competing altogether. She is past the age where marriageable daughters or impressive carriages carry the weight they once did, and she has discovered, seemingly to her own quiet amusement, that this exemption grants her a freedom none of the younger women possess. She says what she thinks mildly at dinner parties, in ways that would be genuinely dangerous coming from Evelina or Lady Vane, and everyone forgives her for it, partly out of respect for her age, partly because her husband's family connections remain formidable even now, and partly, Evelina suspects, because everyone secretly envies her the ability to simply not care anymore. Evelina thinks about this sometimes, more than she would ever say aloud. She thinks about the fact that she is 34, that Mrs. Fenwick is perhaps 60, and that there are still 26 years at minimum between where she stands now and the particular freedom of no longer needing to keep score. It is not a comforting thought most days. This morning, with the letter from Lady Vane still sitting on her desk and a garden party to prepare for by 4 o'clock, it is a thought she has time only to have and not to finish, because Mrs. Hartley is at the door again with a question about seating for this evening's dinner, and the day, as always, does not pause for reflection. By 3:30, the lawn at the south front of Ashcombe has been transformed, and it is worth pausing to appreciate exactly how much labour sits underneath what will look, in an hour's time, like effortless summer ease. 2 footmen and the head gardener's boy have spent the better part of the morning setting out the croquet lawn, which requires the grass cut shorter than usual, cut in fact by hand with shears in the trickiest corners near the flower beds since the mechanical mower cannot manage those edges, the hoops set at precise regulation distances that the head gardener measures with a length of knotted string kept in the potting shed for exactly this purpose and no other. A striped canvas awning has been erected near the terrace, its poles driven into the lawn the night before so the ground would have time to settle around them, and beneath it, trestle tables now stand draped in white linen, the good linen, the kind kept folded in tissue paper in the airing cupboard for precisely these occasions, and washed afterward, separately from the household's everyday sheets. The strawberries Evelina asked about this morning have indeed come in, a full trug of them, and are arranged now in silver dishes alongside sponge cakes, a selection of sandwiches cut so thin they are nearly translucent, and a large iced cake that the cook has been planning for a full week, since a garden party cake, unlike an everyday dessert, is expected to be, in its own quiet way, a small performance of the household's standing. The first carriages begin arriving at 4 exactly, which is itself a small point of etiquette worth knowing. Arriving precisely on time, or worse, early, to a Victorian garden party was considered nearly as gauche as arriving very late. The correct window was 10 to 15 minutes past the stated hour, enough to demonstrate that one had somewhere else important enough to have been doing beforehand, not so much as to seem careless or worse, deliberately rude. Lady Vane's carriage, the new landau in question, comes up the drive at 17 minutes past, and Evelina, standing on the terrace to receive her guests, notes the arrival time with the same automatic private calculation she applies to almost everything Cecilia Vane does. The carriage itself is genuinely handsome, low and open with a folding hood currently down to show off the fine leather upholstery, drawn by a matched pair of greys that Barrett the coachman, watching from a discreet distance near the stable entrance where the visiting carriages are being directed, appraises with the professional interest of a man who has spent 26 years around horses and can tell within seconds whether a pair has been properly matched for temperament as well as colour. Lady Vane descends with the careful, unhurried grace of a woman who knows she is being watched, and has spent years perfecting the appearance of not knowing it. Over the next half hour, guest after guest arrives in this same rhythm, greeted by Evelina and Charles together on the terrace, passed along by Grimshaw, who stands slightly apart with the particular stillness of a man whose entire job in this moment is to be perfectly invisibly available, directing arriving guests toward the lawn, the refreshments, the small groups already beginning to form in the shade of the cedar tree that has stood on this lawn for over 100 years. The Arnsley family arrives at 4:30, Frederick among them, and here is where the day's smaller drama quietly resumes, because Louisa, positioned near the tea table with her cousin and, crucially, with an aunt only a few steps away as etiquette requires, watches his arrival with a composure that costs her considerably more effort than it appears to. The croquet begins shortly after, and croquet in this era occupies a genuinely interesting social function beyond simple entertainment. It is one of the very few outdoor games considered entirely respectable for young unmarried men and women to play together, in mixed company, under only the loosest supervision, and this is precisely why it had become, over the previous decade, so enormously fashionable among households with marriageable daughters. The rules of chaperonage that governed almost every other interaction between young men and young women relaxed, ever so slightly, on a croquet lawn in broad daylight in full view of 50 other guests, and everyone present understood exactly why. Frederick and Louisa end up, with the kind of engineered casualness that both of them have clearly thought about far more than either would admit, on opposing sides of the same game, which permits a great deal of conversation disguised as strategic commentary about mallets and hoops and whose ball has gone where. Her aunt, a Mrs. Iris Thornbury, who has been assigned unofficial chaperone duty for the afternoon, stands nearby with another older woman, ostensibly watching the game, actually engaged in her own quiet conversation about the summer's weather, present but not truly attending, which is in practice exactly the loose sort of supervision this particular game was designed to permit. Elsewhere on the lawn, the tea itself proceeds in its own separate rhythm. Footmen circulate with trays, older guests occupy wicker chairs arranged in the shade, discussing county matters, the price of wheat, A recent scandal 2 estates over involving a younger son and a considerable gambling debt, the sort of conversation that will be picked over and refined for weeks afterward at a dozen other tea tables across the county. Mrs. Fenwick, the widow Evelina thought about so ruefully this morning, has planted herself in the best shaded chair with a cup of tea and an expression of open, unguarded amusement at the entire spectacle, and says, to nobody in particular but loudly enough for several people to hear, that watching young people play croquet is considerably better entertainment than most theatre she has paid for. Evelina herself moves between groups with the particular skill that this kind of hosting demands, a skill so practiced it has become nearly invisible even to her, spending precisely the right number of minutes with each cluster of guests, enough to be warm, not so much as to neglect the others, steering one slightly awkward conversation between two women who dislike each other towards safer ground, complimenting a dress here, asking after a child's health there, and all the while keeping half an eye on the tea table to be sure the strawberries are holding up in the heat and the ice, brought up that morning from the ice house dug into the hillside behind the stables, and packed in sawdust the previous winter when the lake had frozen thick enough to cut, is not melting faster than the kitchen anticipated. There is a moment, a little after 5, when Evelina slips away from the lawn entirely, and I want to tell you about it honestly because it is the part of today she would least want anyone to see. She excuses herself with the simple explanation that she wants to check on preparations for this evening's dinner, which is true as far as it goes, and walks back through the French doors into the cool of the house, through the drawing room, up the back stairs rather than the main staircase, to her own bedroom, where she closes the door and stands for a moment with her back against it, breathing in a way the corset makes considerably harder than it ought to be. The letter is in the drawer of her writing desk, the one she set aside unopened this morning, from the name she did not recognize, and she takes it out now and finally breaks the seal. It is from a physician in London, a specialist she wrote to 3 weeks ago under a name that was not entirely her own, using an address that was not her home, a small arrangement made through a distant cousin in town who agreed, without asking too many questions, to receive correspondence on her behalf and forward it discreetly. The reason for all this careful indirection is this. For the past several months, Evelina has been experiencing symptoms she has told no one about, not her husband, not her sister, not even Sarah, who dresses her every single day and has seen more of her body than anyone alive except Charles, and who would surely have noticed something by now if Evelina had not gone to considerable, exhausting lengths to conceal it. I will not pretend to know exactly what the symptoms are, because Evelina herself does not fully understand them, and this is in fact precisely the problem. There is a persistent tiredness that sleep does not resolve. There is a pain, low and occasional, that comes and goes without pattern she can identify. There was once, back in May, a small amount of blood that frightened her badly enough that she sat alone in this very room for the better part of an hour afterward, saying nothing to anyone, before deciding, with the particular stubborn privacy of a woman raised never to discuss her own body even with her own doctor if it could possibly be avoided, that she would find out what it meant before she told a living soul. This was not, by the standards of her time, an unusual response, though it strikes many people today as almost incomprehensible. Women of Evelina's class and era were raised with an extraordinary degree of physical reticence, taught from girlhood that certain subjects, certain functions of the female body were simply not discussed, not with husbands, not always even with mothers, and certainly never with male physicians beyond the barest necessary description, delivered through layers of euphemism so thick that genuine communication about symptoms was often, in practice, close to impossible. A woman describing pain to a doctor in 1875 might use language so indirect, so hedged around with modesty, that the doctor himself would have to guess at half of what she actually meant. And Evelina, writing her careful, anonymous letter 3 weeks ago, chose her words with exactly this kind of trained caution, describing enough to be useful and nothing more, out of a shame that had nothing to do with any wrongdoing on her part, and everything to do with decades of careful social conditioning about what a lady simply does not discuss. The letter she holds now is not, thankfully, catastrophic. The physician, working only from her careful written description and unable to examine her directly, believes it is most likely a benign condition, something involving her womb that many women experience, and that is, in his professional opinion, unlikely to be immediately dangerous, though he recommends in the polite, hedged language of Victorian medical correspondence that she seek an in-person examination as soon as she is able to arrange one discreetly. An in-person examination. Evelina sits on the edge of her bed, still in her afternoon dress with its 30 small hooks up the back, and considers what this actually means in practical terms, and it is considerably more complicated than the sentence makes it sound. It would mean travelling to London, alone or with only Sarah for company, inventing a reason, shopping, a visit to her sister, something plausible that would not require Charles to accompany her, or even necessarily know the true purpose. It would mean sitting in a consulting room and describing out loud to a man she has never met things she has not said out loud to anyone, including herself, in anything but the vaguest possible terms. It would mean in all likelihood an examination that she has heard described by other women, in whispered fragments never meant for her ears, as humiliating regardless of how professionally it is conducted, because the entire framework of female modesty she has been raised inside has no comfortable place for a stranger's clinical hands. And there is a deeper fear underneath all of this, one she has not fully admitted even to herself until this exact moment, sitting on the edge of her bed with the letter in her hand while, 2 floors below and 100 feet away, 60 guests eat strawberries on her lawn. The fear is this: if it is what she privately suspects, a condition that might eventually affect her ability to have another child, what does that mean for her exactly? In a world where a wife's principal value, however much affection her husband genuinely holds for her, has always been understood by everyone, including herself, to rest substantially on precisely that capacity. She has 3 living children. She knows rationally that this alone secures her position considerably, that Charles is not the kind of man who would ever treat her differently over such a thing, and yet the fear persists anyway, quiet and stubborn, because rational knowledge and deep old fear do not always speak to each other, and Evelina has spent 11 years of marriage absorbing, without ever being told so directly, that a wife's worth in this world is measured along exactly this axis among several others, and old lessons like that do not simply switch off because a kind husband happens to make them, in this particular case largely irrelevant. She folds the letter back along its crease exactly the way Louisa, 2 doors down, folded a very different letter this morning, and returns it to the drawer, beneath a stack of blank writing paper where Sarah would have no reason to look. She stands, checks her reflection in the glass, and adjusts a single hairpin that has come slightly loose, and by the time she walks back down the main staircase and out through the French doors onto the lawn, she is smiling, genuinely, warmly, at Lady Vane, who is telling an amusing story about her son's tutor, and nobody among the 60 guests currently enjoying strawberries and croquet on her lawn would guess from anything visible in her face that she has just spent 10 minutes contemplating a fear she has shared with absolutely no one, and will likely continue sharing with no one for weeks yet, because that too is simply what is required of her, and she has never really known any other way to carry it. Let me step back from the party for a moment, because to understand a day like this one properly, you have to understand the years that built the woman living through it, and Evelina's education, like that of nearly every girl of her class, was designed with a single clear purpose in mind, one that shaped every hour of it, whether or not anyone involved would have described it so bluntly at the time. She was educated at home by a governess named Miss Pruitt, who arrived when Evelina was 6 and stayed until she was 17, and the curriculum, such as it was, bore almost no resemblance to what her brothers received at the same age. Her brothers went away to school and eventually to university, studied Latin and Greek and mathematics with genuine academic seriousness, were prepared for professions, for the law, for the church, for careers that required demonstrated intellectual competence. Evelina was prepared instead for what the era simply called accomplishment, a word that meant something quite specific and quite limited, and it is worth understanding exactly what that meant in practice. She learned French and a little Italian, enough to read a novel or converse pleasantly with a visiting foreign guest, though not with the depth or rigour her brothers applied to Latin. She learned enough history and geography to hold her own in polite conversation without ever venturing into anything that might read as excessive learning, since a young woman who displayed too much intellectual seriousness risked quite genuinely being considered unfeminine, off-putting to the very suitors her education was ultimately meant to attract. She learned needlework from the age of 5, starting with simple sampler stitching, her name and the alphabet worked in careful cross-stitch onto a small square of linen that still hangs, faded now, in the nursery at Ashcombe, progressing over the years into considerably more elaborate work, whitework, embroidery, the kind of fine detailed handwork that could occupy a woman's hands for hours at a stretch, while leaving her face and conversation entirely free for whatever social performance the moment required. This last point is worth sitting with because it explains something people often miss about Victorian needlework. It was not simply a hobby or a decorative pastime, though it was certainly both of those things as well. It was in a very real sense a kind of social technology, a way of occupying oneself visibly and usefully during long afternoons of calls and conversation without appearing idle, since idleness for a woman of Evelina's class carried a genuine moral weight that modern people rarely associate with sitting quietly in a chair. A woman with nothing in her hands during a long afternoon call looked, to Victorian eyes, faintly suspect, as though she had nothing useful to occupy her, whereas a woman working steadily at embroidery while conducting perfectly fluent conversation demonstrated, simultaneously, industry, skill, and grace. 3 qualities the era prized in women in almost equal measure. She learned piano, of course, nearly every girl of her class did, practicing for an hour most days under Miss Pruitt's careful supervision. And here again the purpose was only partly about music itself. A young woman who could play competently, who could sit at the instrument after dinner and provide pleasant entertainment for guests without excessive fuss or false modesty about her own ability, possessed a genuinely valuable social skill, one that made her a more attractive prospect in the marriage market by demonstrating refinement, discipline, and the kind of accomplished femininity the era so prized. Evelina was never a truly gifted musician, by her own honest private assessment, but she is competent, more than competent, capable of playing a Schubert piece or a simple Chopin nocturne, cleanly enough to be genuinely pleasant to listen to. And she still practices most evenings, less now for any social purpose than for the simple private pleasure of it, one of the very few activities in her adult life that exists purely for herself and answers to no one else's expectations. She learnt watercolour painting as well, another accomplishment considered essential rather than optional, and she still keeps a small case of paints and a sketchbook that she takes out perhaps once a fortnight in summer, usually down by the lake, where she will sit for an hour attempting to capture the particular quality of light on water in the late afternoon, rarely satisfied with the result but genuinely absorbed in the attempt, in a way that feels, she has noticed, quite different from the performed accomplishment of her girlhood lessons. There is something in the actual practice of trying to mix the right shade of green for the willows along the bank, of watching the water bleed and settle on the paper in ways she cannot fully control, that she finds unexpectedly calming, a rare activity in her day that has no audience and no verdict attached to it. Reading, too, occupied a curious and somewhat contested place in a young woman's education of this period. Novels in particular were viewed with real suspicion by many parents and governesses, considered potentially dangerous to a young girl's moral development, capable of filling her head with romantic notions unsuited to the practical realities of the marriage market she would soon enter. Miss Pruitt permitted certain novels, carefully vetted, generally after Evelina had reached 15 or so, alongside considerably more history, moral instruction and religious reading that made up the bulk of her permitted material as a younger girl. Evelina remembers with real fondness discovering Jane Austen at 16, reading Pride and Prejudice in secret for the first several chapters before working up the courage to ask Miss Pruitt directly whether she might continue it openly, and being mildly surprised when her governess, whom she had expected to disapprove, simply said that Miss Austen wrote with excellent good sense about matters a young woman would do well to understand thoroughly before she needed to understand them in practice. She reads still, most nights before sleep, though her taste has broadened considerably beyond what Miss Pruitt would have selected for her, and she has, tucked into a drawer of her own writing desk alongside far more respectable material, a well-worn copy of Middlemarch that she has read 3 times now, and finds herself returning to at odd moments, drawn back by something in it she has never quite managed to articulate even to herself. A particular passage about a woman looking out a window at a life that feels, all at once, both entirely full and strangely quietly circumscribed, that she has read so many times the page itself has begun to soften at the corner where her thumb rests each time she turns to it. All of this, the needlework and the piano and the watercolours and the carefully permitted novels, added up over 11 years of girlhood instruction to precisely what it was designed to produce: a woman capable of running a household with quiet competence, holding her own in any drawing room in the county, and appearing at every single moment entirely at ease doing so, nobody watching her play piano after dinner, or work steadily at an embroidery hoop during a long afternoon call, or sketch willows by the lake on a summer evening, would guess how much of it had been built, deliberately, brick by careful brick, for an audience she has spent her entire adult life performing for without ever once being told, in so many words, that this is precisely what she was doing. By 6:30, the garden party has begun its long, gradual dissolution, guests drifting toward their carriages in the particular unhurried rhythm of a summer evening that does not want to end quite yet, and a smaller group, perhaps a dozen of the younger guests along with a few of the more energetic older ones, drift instead toward the lake, where 2 flat-bottomed boats have been waiting all afternoon, moored at a small wooden landing built specifically for this purpose some 20 years earlier by Charles's own father. The lake at Ashcombe is not natural, and this is another one of those details that surprises people, because it looks by now entirely as though it has always been there, its banks softened by decades of willow and reed, its water dark and still in the evening light. It was dug, in fact, by hand, by teams of labourers working over the better part of 2 years back in the 1830s, part of a broader landscaping scheme meant to improve the view from the house's principal windows, a scheme that also involved relocating an entire section of public footpath, diverting a small stream, and planting several hundred trees in careful, deliberately natural-looking clusters, designed to suggest a landscape that had simply always existed this way, when in truth almost nothing about it had. This is worth understanding about the great landscaped grounds of country houses like Ashcombe generally. The apparent naturalness, the sense of a view that simply happened, was itself an enormous and enormously expensive artifice, planned by landscape designers, executed by armies of labourers, and maintained continuously by a full-time staff of gardeners, whose job in large part consisted of making sure nature never actually got the chance to look like itself. A single mature cedar tree, like the one on the front lawn under which Mrs. Fenwick sat drinking her tea this afternoon, might have been transplanted decades earlier at enormous cost and with an entire specialised team dedicated solely to the task, because a landscape designer wanted the tree exactly there and was not willing to wait the additional decades it would take for a sapling to grow into the same effect. Frederick and Louisa end up, again with a casualness that fools nobody paying close attention, in the same boat, though this time the chaperonage is somewhat looser, since Louisa's cousin, a young man named Edmund who is rowing the second boat, has drifted a comfortable but not scandalous distance away, close enough to technically satisfy propriety, far enough to grant something that, in the careful accounting of Victorian courtship, counts as a genuine and rare kind of privacy. Frederick rows with the unhurried competence of a young man who learned on a similar lake at his own family's estate, and for a while neither of them says very much at all, which Louisa finds, somewhat to her own surprise, considerably more comfortable than she expected. The water is smooth and faintly gold with the low evening light, and somewhere along the far bank a moorhen calls once and goes quiet again, and the whole scene has the particular hush of a summer evening that has decided for the moment not to hurry toward its own ending. It is Frederick who finally speaks, and what he says is not on its surface remarkable at all. He asks whether she has read the novel he mentioned in his last letter, and she says she has, and they talk for a while about the book, about a character they both found more sympathetic than the author perhaps intended, and it is by any objective measure an entirely unremarkable conversation about literature between two young people on a boat, and yet underneath it, in the pauses, in the way Frederick lets the oars rest sometimes longer than strictly necessary between strokes, in the way Louisa finds herself trailing her fingers in the cool water and watching the small ripples spread rather than meeting his eyes directly, something considerably less unremarkable is unmistakably happening. The particular charged ordinariness of two people who like each other more than either has yet found the proper occasion, or the proper courage to say outright. He does eventually say one thing that is not quite about the book at all. He mentions with the elaborate casualness of a young man trying very hard not to seem as though he is asking a significant question, that his family's own house party is planned for late August, and that he hopes very much that her uncle's family might be able to attend. Louisa says that she believes they have no other engagements that week, which is in the careful diplomatic language both of them have already learnt to speak fluently despite their youth, as close to an open acknowledgement of mutual interest as either has yet permitted themselves. It is nothing really said aloud. It is, underneath, considerably more than nothing. Evelina watches this small scene from the terrace, at some distance, unable to hear a word of the actual conversation but perfectly capable, from years of watching precisely this kind of courtship unfold among her own social circle, of reading the shape of it from posture alone, the slight lean of two young people toward each other even while discussing something as neutral as a novel, the careful distance Edmund is maintaining in the second boat that suggests he too has noticed something and is granting it room. She says nothing to Charles, standing beside her with a cigar he has just lit, though she does mention mildly that young Annesley seems a steady sort of boy, and Charles, who has noticed rather less than his wife in this particular department, agrees without much thought and returns his attention to the cigar. The light continues to lower over the lake. Somewhere behind them, on the terrace, a footman has begun quietly collecting the last of the tea things, and the day, which began before 5 this morning in a walled kitchen garden with a boy named Thomas cutting lettuce in the dew, has now travelled the full arc of its own long summer light, from that first cool grey hour to this warm gold one, and is beginning at last its slow turn toward evening. By 7:30, the garden party guests have gone, carriages rolling away down the long drive in a loose procession, and the house begins its second entirely separate performance of the day, because there is a dinner tonight for the dozen or so guests staying over, and dressing for a Victorian country house dinner is in its own way a considerably more elaborate production than anything the afternoon required. Evelina is back in her bedroom by 7:45, and Sarah is already waiting, having laid out an hour earlier the dress chosen for this particular evening, a deep wine-coloured silk with a modest train, along with the jewellery that will complete it, a garnet necklace and matching earrings that were a wedding gift from Charles's mother, the same mother arriving tomorrow for her fortnight's stay. A small irony Evelina notices and sets aside without comment. The undressing and redressing that follows takes nearly as long as the morning's routine, and this too tends to surprise people who assume a woman simply changed from one dress into another, the way one might today. In fact, the entire structure comes off, piece by piece in reverse order from how it went on, and much of it goes back on fresh. A new chemise since the days has grown warm and slightly damp in the July heat, the corset relaced, though this time laced somewhat more snugly than this morning's, because evening dress of this period called for a more pronounced, more sculpted silhouette than the relatively relaxed cut of a day dress, and Evelina will feel the difference within the first hour of dinner. A tightness across the lower ribs that she has long since learned to simply not think about, the way one learns not to think about an old familiar ache in a joint that has bothered one for years. Sarah redoes her hair almost entirely, taking down the afternoon style and rebuilding something more elaborate for evening, incorporating a few small silk flowers pinned discreetly among the curls at the crown, a fashion detail Evelina has favoured for several seasons now, since she finds it strikes a balance between fashionable and tasteful, without tipping into the kind of ostentation that some of the younger, less experienced hostesses in the county still occasionally mistake for elegance. The jewellery goes on last, always, the necklace fastened at the back by Sarah's careful fingers, the earrings screwed rather than pierced, since Evelina, like many women of her generation and class, never had her ears pierced as a girl, piercing being considered by many families of this period as slightly common, associated with servants and working women rather than ladies, a small class marker embedded quite literally in the body itself that most people today have entirely forgotten ever existed. There is a particular choreography to a Victorian dinner party that begins well before any guest sits down to eat, and it is worth understanding because so much depends on getting it exactly right. Guests are received in the drawing room beforehand, not the dining room, and the order in which they eventually process into dinner is not casual or accidental in the slightest. It follows a strict hierarchy of precedence based on rank and title, worked out in advance, often with real anxiety on the hostess's part, because getting the order wrong, seating or pairing the wrong guests according to their relative social standing, was a genuine social error that guests noticed, remembered, and occasionally never entirely forgave. Evelina has spent the better part of an hour this week well before today's party, working out tonight's seating and processional order with the help of a small reference book on precedence that sits well thumbed in a drawer of her writing desk alongside the correspondence, because with a dozen guests of varying rank staying over, several of them not personally known to each other, the order in which they walk into the dining room, and beside whom they are seated once they arrive, requires the kind of careful calculation that a modern person might apply to a complex diplomatic seating chart, which is not in fact so very different from what it actually is. The gentlemen by custom each offer an arm to the lady they have been assigned to escort in, an arrangement decided beforehand and communicated quietly to each guest as they arrive in the drawing room, so that by the time Grimshaw appears in the doorway to announce, in the deep formal tone reserved for exactly this purpose, that dinner is served, the entire complex machinery of pairing and precedence has already been silently, invisibly arranged, and the procession into the dining room proceeds with an appearance of effortless natural order that conceals, as with so much else in this house, an enormous amount of careful advance labour. Dinner itself, once everyone is seated, runs to some 8 or 9 courses this evening, since it is a formal occasion with guests staying over, considerably more elaborate than the family's ordinary evening meal, and the choreography continues at the table itself, course after course arriving and departing in a rhythm managed entirely by Grimshaw and the footmen, serving from the left, removing from the right, a rule so deeply ingrained in every servant in this house that none of them could tell you, if asked directly, precisely why it is done that way, only that it has always been done that way, and any deviation would feel, to an experienced eye, immediately and obviously wrong. Conversation at a table like this one follows its own unwritten rules as well. A guest speaks primarily to the person on either side of them, turning first to one, then, at a natural pause, often signalled subtly by the hostess herself, to the other, so that over the course of a long dinner, everyone at the table has had, in principle, a fair distribution of conversation without any single guest monopolizing attention or being left stranded in silence. Evelina, at the head of the table opposite Charles, manages this rhythm across the entire gathering with the same practiced, largely invisible skill she brings to every other aspect of hosting, watching for the guest who has gone quiet too long, the conversation that has drifted somewhere it should not, the moment when the whole table's energy needs a gentle redirection towards something lighter. It is nearly 10 o'clock by the time the meal concludes and the ladies withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and their cigars and whatever conversation men of this class conducted once freed. For a short while, a female company, a custom so entrenched that neither Evelina nor any of the women following her out of the dining room think to question it, though it is worth noting in passing that some of the evening's most consequential business conversations, investments discussed, political alliances quietly formed, occasionally happened in exactly this after-dinner interval, in a room the women of the house were never permitted to enter. Sunday, which fell just 3 days before this one, deserves its own moment here, because religious observance at a house like Ashcombe was never simply a private matter of faith. It was, in a way that would seem strange to many people now, one of the most visibly social occasions of the entire week, and Evelina's Sunday looked in its own particular way every bit as choreographed as tonight's dinner. The family attends the parish church in the village adjoining the estate, a small Norman church with a squat stone tower that has stood in some form for over 600 years, considerably longer than the house itself, and Charles's family has occupied the same pew, the same specific pew near the front on the north side, for something close to 4 generations. This is worth pausing on because pew ownership, or more precisely pew rental, was a genuinely significant and often contentious feature of English parish life throughout this period. The best pews, positioned nearest the front, most visible to the rest of the congregation, were effectively reserved for the wealthiest and most prominent families in the parish, a fee paid annually to secure them, while poorer parishioners occupied benches at the back or in the side aisles, some of them entirely free, some designated specifically for the poor, in a system that made the church's own seating arrangement into a kind of visible, weekly map of the entire parish's social hierarchy. Evelina and her family arrive, as always, in the carriage, timed precisely so that they enter the church just before the service begins, not so early as to sit waiting and watching the rest of the congregation arrive, not so late as to disrupt the service, a small but carefully managed piece of choreography, not so very different from the arrival etiquette that governed this afternoon's garden party. The entire village watches the family's arrival in the discreet sideways way that village congregations always watch the presence of the local gentry, and Evelina is aware every single Sunday of being observed in this particular way, her dress noted, her demeanour assessed, her children's behaviour during the service quietly judged by dozens of eyes that will not meet hers directly but will discuss the details thoroughly over Sunday dinner in a dozen cottages across the village. The vicar, a Reverend Aldous Pemberton who has held this living for nearly 18 years, occupies an interesting and somewhat delicate social position of his own, one worth understanding a little, because he depends in significant part on the goodwill and patronage of exactly the family whose pew sits closest to his pulpit. The living itself, meaning his appointment to this parish and the income attached to it, was in the gift of Charles's own father a generation back, a system called advowson, in which wealthy landowners held the right to appoint clergy to parishes on their estates, and while Reverend Pemberton is by all accounts a genuinely sincere and capable clergyman, nobody in the village, least of all the Reverend himself, would pretend that his sermons never take into account, in some quiet, unspoken way, the sensibilities of the family in the front pew. This morning's sermon, back on Sunday, concerned the parable of the talents, a subject Reverend Pemberton has returned to more than once over the years, and Evelina noticed, as she often does, the particular delicacy with which he navigated its more uncomfortable implications about wealth and stewardship, arriving at a conclusion that managed to praise diligent management of one's resources without ever quite suggesting that the considerable resources sitting in the front pew required any fundamental redistribution. She does not think of this as hypocrisy on the Reverend's part exactly. She thinks of it, when she thinks of it at all, as simply the shape faith takes when it must coexist with the practical realities of patronage, which is to say she has thought about it rather more than most of her neighbours would guess. though she would never say so aloud, least of all to the Reverend himself. After the service, there is the churchyard gathering, another small but genuine social ritual, the congregation lingering outside among the gravestones for perhaps 20 minutes, exchanging news, arranging small parish matters, and Evelina's own role in this is considerable, since she sits, by long tradition and expectation rather than any formal appointment, at the centre of a great deal of the parish's charitable machinery. She organises the flower rota for the altar, a task the vicar's wife wrote to her about just this morning in fact. She oversees a small fund for the relief of the parish's poorest families, distributed with the particular careful discretion the era demanded, since direct charity, however well-intentioned, carried real risk of humiliating its recipients if handled clumsily. She visits, perhaps twice a month, the cottages of elderly or ill parishioners, bringing baskets of food or, more usefully, small sums of money disguised as gifts of preserves or linen, so that the transaction never has to be named directly as charity at all. This last practice, the careful disguising of charity as neighbourly gift-giving, tells you something genuinely important about how Victorian class relations actually worked at the local intimate level, beyond the abstractions of statistics and social theory. Evelina genuinely cares about the well-being of the families she visits, in a way that is neither performed nor cynical, and yet the entire structure of that care operates within a hierarchy she has never once questioned in any serious way, a hierarchy in which she is quite simply the one who gives and they are quite simply the ones who receive, and the possibility that this arrangement might itself be worth examining has genuinely never occurred to her, not because she lacks intelligence or feeling, but because the entire moral architecture of her world was built, from her earliest childhood lessons onward, to make this particular arrangement feel not merely acceptable but actively virtuous, an expression of Christian duty rather than a structure that might, viewed from outside it, look rather different. Sunday afternoon, once the church duties concluded, was quiet by design, a day of rest that the family observed with genuine seriousness. No cards, no dancing, only the mildest of entertainments, a walk in the garden, quiet reading, correspondence of a suitably restrained nature. Evelina spent an hour that particular Sunday afternoon sitting with Louisa in the morning room, both of them reading, though Evelina noticed, without quite placing the significance of it at the time, that her niece seemed unusually distracted, glancing up from her book more than once at nothing in particular, a small detail that makes considerably more sense to us now than it did to Evelina then. While the ladies withdraw to the drawing-room this evening, and the gentlemen linger over their port, let me take you somewhere the guests upstairs will never think to look, because the household running underneath tonight's dinner is, in its own way, every bit as intricate and hierarchical as anything happening above it, and understanding it properly changes how you see everything else. There are 18 indoor servants at Ashcombe, and they exist within a structure so precisely graded that even small variations in status carried genuine weight that determined where a servant sat at the servants' hall table, what they were addressed as, and even, in some cases, whether they were permitted to speak first in a conversation with someone above them in the household's own internal ranking. At the very top sits Grimshaw, the butler, and Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, who between them run the entire operation with an authority that is, within these walls, close to absolute, though it operates entirely within boundaries set by the family above them. Below them comes a tier occupied by the lady's maid Sarah and the valet who attends to Charles, a man named Coombs, both of whom occupy a curious in-between status, since they work in close personal intimacy with the family, know their employers' bodies and private habits more thoroughly than almost anyone else alive, and yet remain, always, servants, a strange dual position that neither Sarah nor Coombs would ever describe as confusing, because they have known nothing else since they entered service as young women and men, but that outside observers often find genuinely difficult to categorize. Below this tier comes the footmen, of whom there are 3 at Ashcombe: Albert, who served breakfast this morning, along with 2 others, and footmen occupied a particular and rather curious place in Victorian household hierarchy. because they were chosen in no small part for their height and their appearance, tall, well-proportioned young men who would look impressive in livery, standing behind chairs at dinner or riding on the back of the carriage, their physical presence functioning almost as a kind of decoration, a visible display of the household's wealth and taste, in a way that servants in less visible roles, however skilled, simply were not required to provide. Below the footmen sit the housemaids, of whom there are 4, responsible for the endless daily labour of cleaning grates, laying and lighting fires, even in July since certain rooms required them regardless of season, making beds, dusting, the sheer unglamorous physical maintenance of a 41-room house that never actually stops, not for a single day, regardless of what else is happening above stairs. Below them again come the kitchen staff, the cook, who commands genuine authority within her own domain, and is paid considerably more than most of the housemaids in recognition of her specialised skill, a kitchen maid, and young Peggy, the scullery maid we met black leading the range before dawn, who occupies, by near universal agreement among the servants themselves, the lowest and least desirable position in the entire household, the one every other servant remembers having occupied themselves at some point, and privately hopes never to return to. And then there is the hall boy, a boy of perhaps 13 named Sam, who does not fit neatly into this hierarchy at all, since his job consists of an endless list of small, unglamorous tasks that nobody else wants, cleaning boots and shoes left outside bedroom doors each night, carrying coal, running errands between the house and the stables or the kitchen garden, and who is treated by the rest of the servants' hall with a particular rough affection that sits somewhere between an apprentice and a household mascot, teased constantly, fed generously by the cook who has a soft spot for him, and given on slow afternoons small unofficial lessons in reading and figures by Mrs. Hartley herself, who has quietly decided that the boy is sharper than his current position suggests, and might, with some encouragement, rise considerably further than hall boy over the coming years. Meals in the servants' hall follow their own rigid hierarchy, one that mirrors in miniature everything happening upstairs. Grimshaw and Mrs. Hartley sit at the head of the table, Sarah and Coombs seated according to their particular rank just below, the footmen next, then the housemaids, then the kitchen staff, with Peggy and young Sam at the very foot of the table. And this seating is not casual or accidental in the slightest. It is understood by every single person in that room as precisely, rigidly correct. The servants' own internal social order, every bit as meaningful to them as the precedence Avelina spent an hour calculating for tonight's dinner guests is to her. There are inevitably small rivalries and alliances below stairs that mirror, in their own way, the rivalries Evelina navigates among Lady Vane and Mrs. Bertram and the rest of her circle. Sarah and Coombs, for instance, have maintained a careful, cordial, faintly competitive relationship for years, each protective of their particular closeness to the family they serve, each quietly convinced that their own role carries slightly more genuine intimacy and importance than the others. One of the housemaids, a girl named Dora, has been engaged in a quiet, ongoing rivalry with another named Susan for some months now, ostensibly over nothing more than whose turn it is to clean the good silver, though everyone in the servants' hall understands perfectly well that the actual source of tension involves a young under-gardener both girls have taken a fancy to, a small romantic drama playing out below stairs with every bit as much intensity and every bit as much careful concealment from those in authority as anything happening between Louisa and Frederick upstairs. Servants at Ashcombe were, by the standards of the time, treated reasonably well. They were paid regularly, fed generously, given a half-day off most weeks and a full day once a month, and Mrs. Hartley in particular took real, if strictly bounded, personal interest in their well-being, writing letters home on their behalf when needed, arranging for a doctor when someone fell ill, as she did for Alice this very morning. And yet the fundamental structure of the relationship remained, in every meaningful sense, one of near total dependency and near total invisibility. A servant dismissed without a good character reference, the written recommendation without which almost no respectable household would consider hiring someone new, faced a genuinely precarious future, and every single servant in this house understood that fact with a clarity that shaped quietly but constantly nearly every decision they made within these walls. Let me tell you about the heat itself for a moment, because this particular July has been unusually warm even by the standards of a summer that everyone in the county will still be talking about years from now. And a house like Ashcombe, built long before anyone had any concept of mechanical cooling, developed its own considerable body of accumulated wisdom for managing exactly this problem, most of it now almost entirely forgotten. The ice house, which we mentioned briefly earlier in connection with this afternoon's strawberries, deserves a proper explanation, because it is one of those pieces of Victorian domestic infrastructure that people today find genuinely startling once they understand how it actually worked. Built into the slope of a hill perhaps a quarter-mile from the main house, half buried in earth for insulation, brick-lined and domed like a small underground chamber, the ice house exists for exactly one purpose: storing ice cut from the lake during the depths of winter, and keeping it, remarkably, frozen or at least solid enough to be useful well into the following summer. The cutting itself happens in January or February, whenever the lake freezes thick enough, a considerable operation involving several of the outdoor staff working with long saws to cut the ice into large blocks, which are then hauled by cart to the ice house and packed, layer upon layer, with straw and sawdust between each layer to slow the melting. Done properly, ice packed this way in a well-built ice house could last, remarkably, the better part of a year, providing cold drinks, chilled desserts, and preserved food right through the hottest months of summer. A genuinely impressive piece of low technology that most people today, surrounded by refrigerators they never think twice about, would find almost magical if they encountered it fresh. The house itself was built, generations back, with a considerable if largely unconscious understanding of passive cooling, thick stone and brick walls that absorb heat slowly during the day and release it slowly at night, high ceilings in the principal rooms that let hot air rise well above head height, tall windows that can be opened top and bottom simultaneously to create a genuine circulation of air, and heavy curtains and blinds that are drawn closed during the hottest hours of the afternoon specifically to keep direct sunlight from heating the rooms further. A practice that strikes modern visitors as counterintuitive, since closing curtains seems to contemporary instinct like something one does at night rather than at 2 in the afternoon. But that made perfect practical sense to a household with no other means of keeping its rooms bearable. Servants adjust their own routines around the heat as well, in ways that rarely occurred to the family upstairs to even notice. The kitchen, dominated by that enormous cast iron range that Peggy blacklead before dawn, becomes genuinely brutal in July, the range itself throwing off heat regardless of the weather outside, since meals must still be cooked whatever the temperature, and the cook and kitchen maid work through the hottest parts of the day in conditions that would today likely be considered a genuine occupational hazard. Sweat-soaked, the kitchen door propped permanently open despite the flies this invites, in a trade-off between heat and pests that the cook has clearly made many times before and settled, without much debate, in favor of the open door. The family's own clothing adapts only modestly to the heat, and this returns us to something we touched on earlier this morning regarding Evelina's corset, because the honest truth is that Victorian fashion for women offered remarkably little genuine relief from summer heat, however much fabric weight and colour shifted seasonally. Lighter fabrics certainly, cotton and linen replacing the heavier wools and silks of winter, paler colours that reflect rather than absorb sunlight, but the fundamental structure, the corset, the multiple petticoats, the long sleeves considered proper even in the height of summer, remained essentially unchanged, and a woman of Evelina's class simply endured considerably more physical discomfort in July than any modern person dressing for a summer day would consider remotely tolerable. Men, interestingly, had somewhat more genuine flexibility, at least within their own private grounds. Charles, for instance, will often remove his jacket and waistcoat entirely when working in his study on a hot afternoon, something that would be considered improper in front of guests but entirely acceptable in the privacy of his own room. A small but real asymmetry in how the two sexes were permitted to negotiate their own physical comfort, that Evelina has noticed over the years, without ever quite framing it to herself as unfair, since unfair was not really a category her upbringing had trained her to apply to the ordinary arrangements of her own life. There is a particular ritual involving verandas and terraces worth mentioning too, because much of the country house social life in high summer deliberately migrates outdoors during the hottest parts of the afternoon, specifically to escape the heat trapped inside the house's thick walls, which is precisely why this afternoon's garden party made such practical as well as social sense. A shaded terrace positioned to catch whatever breeze exists and shielded from direct sun by awnings and mature trees could be genuinely several degrees cooler and considerably more pleasant than any room inside the house itself during the peak afternoon hours. And country house architecture of this period increasingly incorporated exactly this kind of outdoor living space into its design, verandas and covered terraces that functioned in effect as an additional set of rooms usable only in warm weather. Iced drinks, made possible by that same ice house, were considered something of a summer luxury and treated with corresponding ceremony. Lemonade and iced tea, and, for special occasions like today's garden party, an elaborate frozen dessert that the cook prepared using a hand-cranked ice cream churn, packed with ice and salt to lower the freezing temperature further, a laborious process that could take the better part of an hour of continuous cranking by whichever kitchen or hallboy had drawn the unlucky task that day. Young Sam, as it happens, spent a solid 40 minutes this very afternoon turning that crank in the scullery, his arm aching by the end of it, so that the guests on the lawn could enjoy a few spoonfuls of something cold without ever once considering what had gone into producing it. To understand why Louisa's situation carries the particular weight it does this summer, it helps to understand the larger machinery she is caught inside, because a country house garden party like today's is really only one small stage in a much larger, much longer performance that stretched across the entire calendar year. For a family of Evelina's position, the London season, as it was simply called, ran roughly from Easter until the end of July, and it existed for a purpose that everyone involved understood perfectly well, even though almost nobody stated it quite so bluntly in polite conversation. It was, in its essential function, a marriage market, an annual concentration in one city of nearly every eligible young man and woman of a certain class, brought together through a dense, carefully structured schedule of balls, dinners, garden parties, and formal calls specifically designed to allow suitable matches to form under appropriate supervision. Louisa was presented at court 2 seasons ago at 17, in the formal ceremony that marked a young woman's official entry into this marriage market, an event that involved its own enormous production, a white dress with a train of prescribed length, ostrich feathers worn in the hair according to strict regulation, hours of waiting in a long line of carriages outside the palace before the actual presentation itself, which lasted for each individual young woman perhaps 30 seconds, a brief curtsy performed before the monarch and immediately dizzyingly over. And yet those 30 seconds mattered enormously, because presentation at court was in effect a certification, a formal announcement to society that this particular young woman was now eligible, appropriately sponsored, and available to be courted according to all the proper rules. The season that followed her presentation involved an exhausting calendar of balls, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single week during the height of the season, each one requiring its own elaborate preparation, a new dress, or at minimum careful reworking of an existing one, since wearing the identical gown to multiple balls within the same season risked the kind of notice that suggested a family's finances were not quite what they should be. Louisa danced with dozens of young men across that first season, some of them genuinely interested, many of them simply fulfilling the social obligation of dancing with every eligible young woman in a room, and emerged from it at the season's end with no serious attachment formed, a perfectly ordinary outcome for a first season, but one that nonetheless placed a certain quiet pressure on the second. This second season, the one currently underway, carries a weight the first did not, because Victorian society, while never stating it in quite these blunt terms, understood a kind of unofficial clock running on a young woman's marriageability, one that grew more insistent with each season that passed without a serious match forming. A young woman still unmarried by her fourth or fifth season was increasingly, unfairly but genuinely, viewed with a certain pity, or worse, a certain suspicion, as though her continued availability suggested some flaw not immediately visible to the casual observer. Louisa is only in her second season, comfortably within the normal window, but she is aware, in the way young women in her position could not help but be aware, of the larger arithmetic running quietly beneath every ball she attends. Frederick Annesley, for his part, occupies his own particular position within this same market, one worth understanding because it explains something about why his interest in Louisa, however genuine, comes with its own set of complications. He is a second son, not the heir to his family's estate, which will pass, as these things do, to his elder brother, and a second son's prospects, however comfortable his upbringing, depend considerably more on the marriage he makes and the profession he eventually pursues than a first son's ever need to. This is precisely why Louisa's own modest but real inheritance, settled on her by her late mother's family, matters rather more to any calculation of Frederick's suitability than it might for a young woman courted by an eldest son with an estate already guaranteed to him. None of this is spoken aloud between Frederick and Louisa themselves, not in the letters, not in this evening's boat ride, not in any of their carefully chaperoned meetings across the season so far. And yet it sits quietly beneath every interaction, understood perfectly well by both of their families, even as the young people themselves are permitted, and even encouraged, to experience their own courtship as something considerably more romantic and less calculated than the adults around them privately understand it to be. Evelina, watching from her own considerable experience of having navigated this exact machinery herself some 15 years earlier, understands all of this with a clarity that Louisa, still inside the experience rather than looking back on it, does not yet fully possess. She remembers her own second season, the particular anxious arithmetic of it, the way every dance, every conversation, every small kindness or slight from a young man carried a weight that felt at the time like the entire shape of her future life balanced on it. She met Charles in her own third season, not her second, a fact she has never mentioned to Louisa directly, but that sits quietly behind the particular gentleness with which she has watched her niece's own courtship unfold this summer, a gentleness that has nothing to do with naivety about what is actually happening between two young people in a boat on a lake, and everything to do with remembering, with real clarity, exactly what it felt like to be 19 and uncertain and hoping, against the careful calculations of everyone around her, that this particular young man might turn out to be the one who mattered. The drawing room, once the ladies withdraw and before the gentlemen rejoin them some 40 minutes later, has its own particular rhythm, one that Evelina has come to think of, privately, as the evening's most honest hour, because something about the absence of men, however temporary, allows a certain guardedness among the women present to loosen just slightly, not entirely, never entirely, but enough to notice the difference. Lady Vane, seated near the piano with a cup of coffee she will barely touch, is holding forth on a piece of county gossip that has clearly been waiting all evening for exactly this moment, concerning a family 2 estates over whose eldest son has apparently run up gambling debts, serious enough that his father is said to be considering selling off a parcel of land that has been in the family for generations. She tells it with the particular relish of a woman who has clearly rehearsed the delivery, pausing at the right moments, lowering her voice at the most delicious details, and Evelina listens with the practiced expression of polite interest that gives away nothing of her own private assessment, which is that Cecilia Vane has always had a genuine talent for this particular kind of storytelling, and a rather less admirable tendency to embellish the details in whatever direction makes the story land hardest. Mrs. Bertram, seated slightly apart from the main cluster of women in a way Evelina notices without commenting on, contributes little to this particular conversation, and Evelina finds herself, watching this, feeling an unexpected twinge of something like sympathy, because she recognizes, with the clarity of long practice, the particular exclusion of a woman whose own family's finances are, whatever their genuine wealth, still new enough to make gossip about other families' financial troubles feel like treacherous ground to wade into. Mrs. Fenwick predictably says the one thing nobody else quite dares, remarking dryly that she has heard 3 different versions of this exact story over the past fortnight, each one assigning the blame to a different vice entirely, and that she has learned over the years to believe roughly none of any single version and about half of all 3 combined, a comment that produces a ripple of laughter, and Evelina notices a small flicker of genuine relief on Mrs. Bertram's face, since the widow's characteristic bluntness has, without either woman quite intending it, rescued the conversation from its sharper edges. Someone suggests music, as someone always eventually does, and Louisa is asked to play, a request that carries its own small social weight, since a young unmarried woman's musical performance in company remains, even now, one of the more visible ways her accomplishments are put on display before precisely the sort of audience whose opinion might eventually matter to her prospects. She plays a piece she has practiced carefully for exactly this kind of occasion, competent, pleasant, not so ambitious as to risk a visible stumble, and receives the warm, slightly performed applause that such moments always generate. Applause that Evelina, watching her niece rise from the piano stool with the particular relief of a young woman glad to have gotten through it cleanly, recognizes from her own girlhood as containing genuine warmth alongside something more assessing underneath it. Cards come out after the music, a few tables forming for whist, and here the conversation shifts register again, becoming quieter, more focused, punctuated by the particular clipped exchanges of a card game rather than the freer conversational flow of before. Evelina partners with Mrs. Fenwick against Lady Vane and an older neighbour, and finds herself, across several hands, enjoying the widow's company rather more than she generally permits herself to acknowledge, since Mrs. Fenwick's running commentary on the game, delivered in an undertone meant only for Evelina's ears, is genuinely, quietly funny in a way that few of her more careful, more guarded social equals ever risk being. At one point between hands, Mrs. Fenwick asks Evelina, apropos of nothing in the conversation immediately preceding it, whether she is quite well, a question asked with enough directness that Evelina, caught slightly off guard, takes a beat too long to answer. She recovers quickly, says she is simply tired from the day's preparations, and Mrs. Fenwick, who has clearly noticed something in her manner without being told what it is, does not press further, only holds her gaze a moment longer than strictly necessary before returning her attention to her cards, a small silent acknowledgement that something is being carried, and that the widow, whatever else she might say aloud tonight about gambling debts and county gossip, has no intention of prying it loose before Evelina is ready to offer it herself. The gentlemen rejoin them a little before 11, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and port, and the conversation shifts register once more, becoming, as it always does once the two sexes reconvene, somewhat more general, somewhat more careful, the particular unguarded quality of the all-female hour receding back beneath the surface the way it always does, the moment the drawing-room doors open again. Charles crosses to Evelina's side and asks, quietly, whether she has had a pleasant evening, and she says yes, entirely truthfully as far as it goes, and does not mention the letter still sitting in her writing desk drawer, nor the particular way Mrs. Fenwick's question landed a few minutes earlier, nor the small persistent worry that has been sitting somewhere beneath her ribs, alongside the corset's own considerable pressure, for most of this long day. Let me pull back further still, because the house and the party and the courtship and the letter in Evelina's drawer all sit inside something larger, an entire economic structure that most of tonight's guests would never think to examine directly, though every single one of them depends on it completely. Ashcombe Park is not simply a house with pretty grounds, it is the visible centre of an estate running to some 6,000 acres, the majority of it let out to tenant farmers who work the land and pay rent to Charles as their landlord, a relationship that structures the entire economic life of this stretch of countryside in ways both obvious and easy to overlook. there are perhaps 40 tenant farms across the estate, ranging from substantial operations run by families who have held the same land for 3 or 4 generations, to smaller holdings barely large enough to support a single family. And Charles's income, the income that pays for 18 indoor servants and a corset laced by a lady's maid and a garden party for 60 guests, derives overwhelmingly from these rents rather than from any active labour of his own. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something genuinely important about the peculiar rhythm of Charles's own days, which look, compared to Evelina's relentlessly scheduled hours, almost leisurely by contrast. He rides out perhaps twice a week to inspect the estate, meeting with his land agent, a capable man named Whitfield, who handles the actual day-to-day management of tenancies, rent collection, repairs to farm buildings, disputes over boundary hedges or drainage, the entire practical machinery that keeps 40 tenant farms functioning. Charles's own role in most of this is closer to oversight than direct management, reviewing Whitfield's accounts, making final decisions on larger matters, a new lease, a significant repair, the occasional difficult decision to raise rents or, more rarely and more reluctantly, to evict a tenant whose payments have fallen too far behind. The tenant farmers themselves occupy their own complicated position in this world, neither servants exactly nor equals, dependent on Charles's goodwill in ways that could be genuinely precarious, subject to eviction if rents went unpaid for too long, and yet possessing, many of them, a rootedness in this particular land that in some cases considerably predates the current family's own occupation of the great house itself. There is a family named Colby, for instance, farming some 300 acres toward the eastern edge of the estate, who have held that same tenancy for over a century, through 4 generations of Colbys and, as it happens, 3 generations of the family currently residing at Ashcombe. And the relationship between the two families, while never remotely equal, carries a genuine mutual familiarity built across those generations that neither side would describe in quite such formal economic terms. Charles's own father inherited this estate from his father before him, and the land itself, in its broad outlines, has belonged to this family since the early part of the previous century, when an ancestor, having made a considerable fortune in trade, a fact the family discusses rather less often than its subsequent generations of respectable land ownership, purchased the original core of the estate and set about the very deliberate, very expensive project of transforming trade money into landed gentility, a transformation that took, in practice, the better part of 3 generations to complete fully, since old land, in the eyes of the established aristocracy, was never quite equivalent to new land regardless of how much money changed hands to acquire it. This history sits largely unspoken beneath a great deal of the social anxiety we have already touched on this evening, because Mrs. Bertram's own position, newer money still working its way toward the same kind of settled respectability Charles's family achieved 2 generations back, is not so very different in its essential shape from where Charles's own great-grandfather once stood. Evelina has never once made this comparison aloud, not even to herself in any fully articulated way, and yet some quiet, largely unconscious awareness of it likely explains a good deal of the particular sympathy she felt earlier this evening watching Mrs. Bertram sits slightly apart from Lady Vane's gossip, since old money's disdain for new money always carries, somewhere beneath it, the inconvenient fact that all old money was, at some point in its own history, new. The house itself was largely rebuilt by Charles's grandfather in the early part of the century, replacing an older, considerably more modest structure with the present 41-room building designed in the fashionable style of its era. And this rebuilding, too, cost a fortune that took years to recoup through careful management of the estate's rents and, in some lean years, required borrowing against the land itself, a fact that would likely surprise guests who assume, looking at the house's solid, permanent-seeming grandeur, that such wealth simply exists rather than having been built, financed, and occasionally precariously maintained across generations of careful, sometimes anxious management. Whitfield, the land agent, lives in a substantial house of his own on the estate, considerably more comfortable than any tenant farmhouse but decidedly less grand than Ashcombe itself, occupying his own particular middle position in this hierarchy, neither gentry nor tenant nor servant, a professional man whose expertise Charles genuinely depends on, and whose own son, as it happens, has recently begun training as a solicitor in the county town, a small but real step up the social ladder that Whitfield discusses with quiet, careful pride whenever the subject arises, aware, as everyone in this entire interconnected world seems to be in one way or another, of exactly where they currently stand and exactly how far, with sufficient care and sufficient luck, the next generation might yet manage to climb. Up in the nursery wing, on the second floor at the quieter end of the house, the children's day has run on its own entirely separate schedule, one that intersects with Evelina's own considerably less often than modern parents might expect. And this too is worth understanding, because it was not considered neglectful by the standards of the time, but simply the ordinary, proper way a household of this class raised its young. Cecily, the 4-year-old we glimpsed at her window before dawn, spends the great majority of her waking hours in the care of her nurse, a woman named Nurse Bidwell, who has raised, in her long career, the children of several different families before coming to Ashcombe some 6 years back, and whose entire professional authority rests on a kind of practical, hands-on expertise in the physical care of small children that Evelina, for all her own competence in running the household, does not herself possess in anything like the same depth. Nurse Bidwell manages Cecily's meals, her naps, her bathing, her small daily illnesses and complaints, with a briskness born of genuine experience, and Cecily in turn has formed with her the kind of deep, unguarded attachment that small children often form with the adult who tends them daily, an attachment that Evelina, watching sometimes from a small distance, has never resented exactly but has occasionally, in her most private moments, felt a small pang about, wondering whether her own daughter's first and truest sense of comfort belongs in practice to someone else's arms rather than her own. This is not to say Evelina is absent from her children's lives, only that her presence follows a specific, ritualized rhythm rather than the constant daily immersion a modern parent might assume. There is the nursery visit each morning after breakfast, a half-hour or so in which Evelina sits with Cecily and her elder brother, a boy of 7 named Henry who has just begun lessons proper with a tutor rather than remaining solely under Nurse Bidwell's care, hearing about their previous day, admiring a drawing, listening to Henry recite something he has learned. There is, most days, an hour in the late afternoon when the children are brought down, freshly washed and in clean clothes, to see their mother and occasionally their father in the drawing room, a ritual so consistent across upper-class Victorian households that it had its own name, simply the children's hour, understood by everyone involved as a bounded, pleasant interval rather than an open-ended immersion in ordinary family life. Henry's lessons, now that he has passed from the nursery's care into the tutor's, look considerably more like his father's own boyhood education than anything his sister will receive. Latin grammar, arithmetic, geography, the beginning foundations of the classical education that will eventually, if the family's plans hold, carry him to the same public school his father attended, and from there, likely, to Oxford or Cambridge and a suitable profession beyond. His tutor, a young university graduate named Mr. Aldridge employed specifically for this purpose, lives in his own rooms at the house, and conducts lessons each morning in a small schoolroom set aside for exactly this use. And Henry, by all accounts including his own occasionally grumbled ones, finds the work considerably harder than whatever gentler instruction his sister will eventually receive. Cecily's own future education, once she is old enough, a few years yet, will follow the pattern Evelina herself experienced, a governess rather than a tutor, accomplishments rather than classical rigour, a preparation for a marriage market rather than a university. And Evelina, thinking about this sometimes with a complexity of feeling she rarely examines too closely, finds herself uncertain what she actually wishes for her daughter beyond the obvious wish that she be happy, since the alternative to the education Evelina herself received is not something she has any real framework for imagining. no different model having ever been presented to her as remotely plausible for a girl of Cecily's class and prospects. Discipline in the nursery follows its own conventions as well, considerably firmer by modern standards though not, within the context of its own era, considered unusually harsh. Nurse Bidwell maintains order through a combination of routine, mild reproof, and the occasional withholding of a small pleasure, an extra story, a sweet after dinner, rather than anything approaching physical punishment, which she considers, and has said so plainly to Evelina on more than one occasion, both unnecessary and, in her professional experience, considerably less effective than consistency and patience applied steadily over time. This was not universal across all households of the period. Some nurseries and schoolrooms of this era were considerably harsher, but at Ashcombe, Nurse Bidwell's particular philosophy, quietly endorsed by Evelina, who trusts her judgment on these matters completely, has produced two children who are, by most measures, cheerful, biddable, and reasonably content within the bounded, carefully structured world their class and era have arranged for them. There is a third child too, a boy not yet two named Arthur, still fully within the nursery's most intensive care, fed and bathed and tended almost entirely by Nurse Bidwell and an under-nursery maid, a young woman of 16 named Grace who assists with the heavier physical labour of nursery life, the endless laundry of small garments, the carrying of trays up and down the back stairs, the constant low-level watchfulness that a toddler requires. Evelina visits Arthur each morning as well, delights in him in the particular unguarded way parents often reserve for their youngest, and yet knows, with the same quiet resignation that has accompanied each of her children through this exact stage, that his deepest early attachments are forming, largely, toward Grace and Nurse Bidwell rather than toward herself, a fact of upper-class Victorian motherhood that Evelina has made her uneasy peace with over the years, without ever quite deciding whether that peace is genuine acceptance or simply practiced resignation. It is this same nursery, this same quiet second-floor wing, where Cecily stood at her window this very morning before dawn, watching a gardener she could not identify push a wheelbarrow across the lawn, and wondering what his life might be like. A small child's idle curiosity about a world she has no real access to, not so very different, in its essential shape, from the curiosity with which the rest of this household, upstairs and downstairs alike, spends so much of their time wondering about lives other than the one they happen to have been born into. Let us go back briefly to that after-dinner hour in the dining room, once the ladies had withdrawn, because something worth understanding happened there too, quietly, over port and cigars, in the particular register men of this class reserved for exactly this kind of gathering. Charles presides at the head of the now considerably emptier table, the cloth still bearing the debris of the meal's final courses, decanters of port circulating clockwise around the table according to a custom so old that none of the men present could tell you its precise origin, only that passing the decanter counterclockwise would be, to every man in this room, immediately and obviously wrong, in exactly the way serving from the wrong side would strike Grimshaw as wrong at the table itself. The conversation ranges, as it typically does among men of this class in this particular after-dinner setting, across politics, land and money, subjects considered by the conventions of the era somewhat too dry or too indelicate for mixed company but entirely appropriate once the ladies have gone. One of the guests, a member of Parliament for a neighbouring county, discusses at some length a piece of agricultural legislation currently before the House, concerning tariffs on imported grain, a subject that touches Charles's own interests rather directly, since the price of wheat affects, in turn, what his tenant farmers can afford to pay in rent, and Charles listens with the genuine, engaged attention of a man whose actual income depends considerably on exactly this kind of policy detail, however abstract it might sound to an outside listener. There is talk, too, of a scandal in the city, a bank that has recently failed, ruining a number of investors, including, apparently, a cousin of one of the guests present, and the men discuss this with a particular blend of genuine sympathy and quiet private relief that their own investments, more conservatively placed in land and government securities rather than the riskier speculative ventures that brought this particular bank down, remain untouched, a relief none of them would ever phrase so bluntly but that sits unmistakably beneath the sympathetic tone of the conversation. Frederick Annesley, present at this table as one of the family's overnight guests along with his father, says relatively little during this stretch of conversation, listening more than speaking, which Charles notices with a certain quiet approval, since he has always found young men who talk too freely on subjects of business and politics before they have any real experience of either to be considerably less impressive than they imagine themselves to be. At one point, however, the conversation turns briefly to the subject of second sons and professions, a subject that touches Frederick's own situation rather directly, and he speaks with what strikes Charles as genuine, unpretentious clarity about his intention to read for the bar, following, as it happens, rather a similar path to the one Constance's husband took in an entirely different county some years back, a small echo between two stories that neither man at this particular table has any way of knowing about. Charles finds himself, without quite deciding to, forming a favourable impression of the young man, an impression he will mention to Evelina later in the mild, understated way he mentioned it on the lake earlier this evening, without either of them yet discussing directly what either has separately noticed about Frederick's interest in Louisa, since this too follows its own careful unspoken timing, a subject that will need to be raised properly, formally, at the right moment, likely once Frederick's own father has made some indication of his son's serious intentions, rather than discussed casually over cigars before any formal understanding exists. The cigars themselves, imported from Havana at considerable expense, are offered from a box Grimshaw brought in and set before Charles at the meal's conclusion, and the ritual of selecting, cutting and lighting one carries its own small performance of leisured masculine ease, a performance every man at this table has spent years perfecting to the point where it no longer feels like performance at all, simply the natural, unhurried way an evening concludes among men of their particular position. There is a moment, toward the end of this 3/4 of an hour, when the local member of Parliament raises, somewhat delicately, a question about the coming autumn's political prospects, since there is talk of a general election within the year, and asks Charles directly whether he has considered standing for a seat himself, a suggestion that is not entirely new to Charles, who has weighed it privately more than once over the past several years, without ever quite committing to the considerable expense and disruption a parliamentary career would introduce into a life that already runs, by his own estimation, quite comfortably as it is. He gives a characteristically careful, non-committal answer, the kind that leaves the door open without walking through it, and the conversation moves on to other matters, though the question itself will return to him later, tonight in fact, in the quiet hour before sleep, in a way he has not yet mentioned to Evelina, and is not entirely certain how she would receive if he did. By the time the men rejoin the ladies a little before 11, the port decanter has made its rounds perhaps 3 times, the cigars have burned down to their final inches, and the particular unhurried, expansive quality of masculine after-dinner conversation has run its natural course, ready now to give way to the more general, mixed conversation of the drawing-room, where Evelina, Charles will discover shortly, has spent her own considerably more guarded and complicated evening among the women of her circle, an evening whose particular undercurrents he will not learn about tonight, or perhaps ever in anything like their full complexity, while the family lingers over their final hour in the drawing-room. The house around them has already begun its own separate process of settling for the night, and this too follows a rhythm so precise and so consistent that it might as well be its own kind of clockwork, one that runs every single night, regardless of whether there is a dinner party upstairs or simply an ordinary quiet evening. Grimshaw begins the locking up somewhat before the last guests have gone to bed, moving through the ground floor rooms in a set order he has followed for over 20 years, checking each window latch, drawing curtains that have not already been drawn, securing the French doors that lead out onto the terrace where, only hours earlier, 60 guests stood eating strawberries in the July sun. He checks the silver, counts it against a list kept for exactly this purpose, and locks it away in the plate closet, a small windowless room fitted with its own substantial door and lock. Since the household silver represents, in its accumulated value, a sum that would take most of the servants in this house several lifetimes of wages to earn, and its security is treated, accordingly, with a seriousness that borders on the ceremonial. Mrs. Hartley, meanwhile, makes her own final rounds of the kitchen and storerooms, confirming that the kitchen fire has been properly banked for the night, a specific technique involving covering the coals with ash in a way that keeps them smouldering slowly through the dark hours without burning out entirely, so that in the morning the under-kitchen maid can simply uncover them and add fresh fuel, rather than needing to build an entirely new fire from scratch. A small but genuinely significant labour saving that every household of this era understood and relied upon. The housemaids, whose day began at 5:30 this morning, are largely already in bed by this hour, sleeping in shared rooms in the attic story, above the family's own bedrooms but considerably plainer, simple iron bedsteads and thin curtains against windows that let in rather more of the summer heat than the family's own well-shaded rooms below, since attic rooms closest to the roof retain daytime heat considerably longer into the night, a discomfort the servants simply endured as an unremarkable feature of where they slept. A detail that would strike most modern people as a genuine hardship, but that none of the housemaids at Ashcombe would have thought to complain about, since it was, quite simply, how things were. Sarah, Evelina's lady's maid, is not yet in bed, since her day cannot properly end until Evelina's does, and she waits now in the small dressing room adjoining Evelina's bedroom, ready for the final undressing that will come once the family finally retires, an hour or more away, yet given how late tonight's dinner and its aftermath have run, this is one of the genuine asymmetries of the lady's maid's position, a job whose hours are dictated entirely by her mistress's own schedule rather than any fixed shift, meaning that on a night like this one, with guests and a late dinner, Sarah's day will run considerably longer than the housemaid's who are already sound asleep 2 floors above her. Coombs, Charles's valet, occupies a similar position, waiting in his own small anteroom off Charles's dressing room, and the 2 valets and maids of a house like this, across dozens of similar households throughout the county, form their own small, quiet fraternity of people whose working lives are structured entirely around waiting for their employers to be ready for them, a peculiar kind of labour that consists in significant part simply of availability, of being present and prepared at whatever hour is eventually required, a form of work that leaves little visible trace and is rarely counted, by anyone including the servants themselves, as work in quite the same sense as scrubbing a grate or blackleading a range, though it is in its own quiet way every bit as demanding. Young Sam, the hall boy whose arm ached this afternoon from turning the ice cream churn, has been asleep for hours already in his small room off the kitchen passage, exhausted in the particular thorough way of a 13-year-old who has been on his feet, in one capacity or another, since well before dawn, and will be again tomorrow, the endless cycle of this particular household summer continuing regardless of how late tonight's family and guests choose to stay up talking in the drawing room above. Peggy, the scullery maid, is likewise long asleep, in a small room shared with the kitchen maid, and her dreams, if she has any tonight, are probably not especially remarkable, the ordinary undirected dreams of a 15-year-old worn out by physical labour, though it is worth noting in passing that Peggy's entire existence within this household, her hands blackened each morning by the range, her presence essentially invisible to every single guest who ate strawberries on the lawn today, will resume again in less than 4 hours at 4:30, when she rises once more to begin the exact same work she began this same morning, in a cycle that will continue day after day, season after season, for as long as her health and her position both hold, with little prospect of significant change beyond the eventual hope, shared by nearly every servant at the very bottom of a household's hierarchy, of one day rising to a slightly better position within it, or, more realistically for many, simply enduring in the position they currently hold until age or illness or marriage eventually removes them from it altogether. The stables too have gone quiet. Barrett and the undergrooms long since finished with the evening's feeding and mucking out. The 11 horses settled in their stalls for the night. The carriage that carried Lady Vane home hours ago cleaned and returned to its place in the coach house, ready to be brought out again whenever it is next required, which, given the family's social calendar for the remainder of the summer, will likely be considerably sooner than anyone currently asleep in that stable block would prefer. It is nearly midnight by the time Evelina finally climbs the stairs to her own bedroom, Charles having stayed behind a while longer in the billiard room with 2 of the male guests who showed no particular inclination towards sleep, and Sarah, waiting exactly where Evelina expected to find her, begins the long unwinding of the evening's dress with the same unhurried competence she brought to putting it on some 4 hours earlier. The corset comes off last, as it always does, and Evelina feels the particular rush of relief that never quite loses its intensity no matter how many thousands of times she has experienced it, her ribs expanding fully for what feels, after 14 hours of restriction, like the first genuinely deep breath of the entire day. Sarah says nothing about it, has never once commented on this moment in 9 years of service, though Evelina sometimes wonders whether Sarah, lacing and unlacing this same garment day after day, understands its particular toll on her mistress's body better than Evelina herself has ever articulated even privately. Alone at last, in her nightgown, hair let down and brushed out by Sarah before she withdrew for the night, Evelina sits at her writing desk rather than climbing directly into bed, and takes out once more the letter from the London physician, reading it a second time by the light of a single candle, more slowly this time, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives only late at night, once the day's performances have finally been set down. She has decided, somewhere in the space between the lake this evening and this quiet midnight hour, what she is going to do, though the decision has arrived less as a single dramatic moment of resolve, and more as a kind of settling, the way sediment in a glass of water eventually, given enough stillness, simply sinks to the bottom and the water above clears. She will write back to the physician tomorrow, using the same careful arrangement through her cousin in town, and she will arrange within the next fortnight a visit to London under the pretext of shopping for autumn fabrics, a pretext plausible enough that Charles will think nothing of it. Plausible enough even that she might genuinely do some shopping while she is there, since there is no reason the two purposes cannot comfortably coexist within the same 3 days away. She will take Sarah with her, as she always does when travelling, and she has decided, somewhere in this same quiet stretch of thinking, that she will tell Sarah at least part of the truth before they go. Not everything, not the full weight of her private fear about what a compromised ability to bear further children might mean for how Charles, or the wider world, might eventually regard her, but enough that Sarah can help her manage the practical logistics of an appointment that will require, at some point, genuine physical privacy and genuine physical vulnerability in front of a stranger. And Evelina finds, turning this decision over in the candlelight, that trusting Sarah with even this much feels, surprisingly, less frightening than she expected it to feel when she first began quietly considering it some days ago. She will not tell Charles yet. This too is a decision she has arrived at rather than simply defaulted into, and she examines her own reasoning for it honestly, in this rare late hour when honesty with herself comes somewhat easier than it does during the fully performed hours of daylight. It is not, she decides, primarily about protecting him from worry, though there is some of that. It is more that she wants to know first precisely what she is dealing with, wants the physician's actual clinical assessment in hand before she has to manage her husband's reaction to news that is, as yet, still genuinely uncertain in its severity. She has spent 11 years managing nearly every practical and social dimension of this household, with a competence nobody has ever needed to double-check, and she finds, examining the impulse honestly, that she wants to manage this too on her own terms for as long as she reasonably can before handing any part of it over to someone else's concern, however loving that concern would certainly be. There is something else too, something she turns over more slowly, more carefully, because it touches a part of her marriage she has never quite examined this directly before. She loves Charles, genuinely has loved him for 11 years in the settled, comfortable way of two people who have built an entire shared life together, and yet she recognizes, in this quiet midnight hour, that some portion of what she offers him, what she has always offered him, operates within a kind of unspoken transaction neither of them has ever named aloud: her competence and her body and her capacity to produce heirs in exchange for the position, the security, the entire structure of the life she inhabits. She does not think Charles would ever consciously frame their marriage in such stark terms, and she suspects, examining her own feelings honestly, that he genuinely loves her for herself and not merely for what she provides. But the fear she named to herself earlier this evening, sitting on the edge of this same bed with the letter freshly opened, has not entirely dissolved simply because she has now made a plan to address the medical question directly. It sits somewhere underneath the plan, quiet, persistent, the kind of fear that does not require logic to maintain its grip, only the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent understanding, however subtly, however rarely acknowledged directly, exactly what a woman in her position is understood to be worth, and to whom and under what conditions that worth might quietly shift. She blows out the candle a little after midnight, the letter returned to its drawer, the decision made, and climbs into bed beside the space that Charles will not fill for another half-hour or more yet, and lies for a while in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, the floorboards somewhere contracting as it cools, the faint call of an owl from the direction of the lake, and finds, somewhat to her own surprise, that having finally made a decision about the letter, however uncertain its eventual outcome, she feels lighter than she has in nearly 3 weeks, the particular relief of a burden that has not been resolved, but has at least been given a clear next step, which turns out, this late at night, to be very nearly the same thing. Let me take you back to the kitchen for a moment, because we left it early this morning with Peggy still black-leading the range, and there is a whole world of labour that passed through that room across the day we have not yet properly seen, labour that made today's garden party and tonight's 9-course dinner possible without a single guest upstairs ever once considering where any of it actually came from. The cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Renner, who has run this kitchen for 14 years and answers in matters of her own domain to nobody but Mrs. Hartley, and on rare occasions requiring real authority to Evelina herself, began her preparations for today's gooseberry preserving before the sun was fully up, since gooseberries once picked do not wait patiently for a convenient hour. The still-room maid brought in perhaps 30 pounds of fruit from the kitchen garden, gathered by Thomas and the garden boy in the same early hour we saw them cutting lettuce, and by mid-morning Mrs. Renner and her kitchen maid were standing over enormous copper preserving pans, stirring fruit and sugar in a ratio she has calculated from long experience rather than any written recipe, watching for the particular moment when the mixture reaches setting point, tested, in the absence of any thermometer, by dropping a small amount onto a cold saucer and watching whether it wrinkles when pushed with a finger. This single afternoon's work will produce perhaps 40 jars of gooseberry preserve, enough to supply the household's breakfast table and its various charitable baskets, the ones Evelina distributes disguised as neighbourly gifts to elderly parishioners well into the following winter, and this points to something genuinely important about how a household of this size actually fed itself across an entire year. Nearly everything consumed at Ashcombe, beyond a handful of imported luxuries like tea, coffee, spices, and the wine Grimshaw selected so carefully from the cellar this morning, was produced somewhere on the estate itself and preserved, through jam-making, pickling, salting, and storage in the cool of the cellars and the icehouse, to last through the seasons when fresh produce was not available. The larder, a cool stone room off the kitchen passage kept deliberately dim and well ventilated, held at any given moment an extraordinary inventory that Mrs. Renner tracked in significant part from memory alone, supplemented by a written stockbook she updated most evenings. Hams and sides of bacon hanging from hooks, cured in the household's own smokehouse from pigs raised on the home farm. Sacks of flour milled from wheat grown on the estate's own tenant farms, since even a household as wealthy as this one relied substantially on its own land's produce rather than purchasing everything from outside markets. rows of preserved fruit in jars sealed with waxed paper and string, the previous year's harvests still being worked through even as this year's gooseberries went into their own jars this same afternoon. The dairy, a separate small building kept scrupulously clean and cool, produced the household's own butter and cheese from a small herd of cows kept specifically for this purpose, and the dairymaid, a young woman named Ruth who rises even earlier than Peggy to see to the morning milking, churns butter most days using a technique passed down through several generations of dairymaids before her, watching for the particular sound and resistance in the churn that signals the cream has finally turned, a skill that, like so much else in this house, looks effortless to anyone who has never actually attempted it, and turns out, on closer inspection, to require years of accumulated bodily knowledge that no written instruction could ever fully substitute for. Meat for tonight's elaborate 9-course dinner came from several sources. A haunch of venison from deer kept in the estate's own park specifically for this purpose, a practice with roots going back centuries to when deer parks were themselves a mark of aristocratic status quite apart from their practical use as a meat source, alongside poultry raised in the home farm's yards, and fish brought in fresh that very morning by cart from the coast some 20 miles distant, packed in ice from, once again, that same remarkable ice house. Since fresh sea fish inland was a genuine luxury that depended entirely on speed and, crucially, on ice that had been carefully saved from the depths of the previous winter for exactly this kind of summer occasion, the sheer logistics of feeding this household, family, 18 indoor servants, and today additionally 60 garden party guests and a dozen overnight dinner guests, represented a planning and provisioning challenge that Mrs. Renner and Mrs. Hartley managed between them with a precision that neither woman would describe as remarkable, since it was, quite simply, their job, performed at this level of complexity every single week of the year regardless of whether any particular week included a party at all. Menus were planned days in advance, ingredients ordered from the estate's own produce where possible, and from tradesmen in the nearest market town where not, deliveries tracked, spoilage anticipated and minimized, and the entire operation run with a level of institutional memory and quiet competence that, had either woman been born a generation or two later and into a different class entirely, might well have made either of them formidable managers of considerably larger and more visible enterprises than a single country house kitchen, a thought that occasionally crosses Mrs. Hartley's own mind late at night, though she has never once said so aloud to anyone, including herself in any fully formed sentence, since such thoughts in her particular position and era led nowhere useful and were, on the whole, better left where they lay. 2 floors up and a little further along the corridor, Louisa is also still awake in her own smaller bedroom, in her own nightgown, having dismissed Ivy some 20 minutes earlier with an easiness that conceals, as it has for weeks now, the small ongoing conspiracy between them. She takes out Frederick's letter one final time before sleep, not to read it again, she has read it enough times tonight already, but simply to hold it for a moment, and she finds herself turning over, in the particular unguarded way of a young woman on the edge of sleep, the exact words he used this evening on the lake. The mention of his family's house party in late August, the careful, deliberate casualness with which he raised it, and what it might mean, and what she wants it to mean, and the considerable gap that still exists, this warm July night, between those two things. She is genuinely fond of him, she decides, turning the word over carefully, testing whether it is strong enough, or whether some other word, closer to the ones Miss Austen's heroines occasionally allow themselves in the novels she still keeps, carefully hidden alongside more sanctioned reading, in a small trunk under her bed. She thinks it might be closer to that other word, though she is 19 and has been raised thoroughly and from earliest childhood to distrust her own romantic instincts as potentially unreliable, potentially the product of youth and inexperience rather than genuine discernment. And so she holds the feeling carefully, at something of a remove even from herself, the way one might hold a hot dish with a cloth rather than bare hands. There is a particular fear she carries too, one she has not named even to Ivy, which is the fear that she is wrong about him, that the warmth she reads in his letters and in his manner on the lake this evening is, in fact, simply the ordinary practiced charm of a young man moving pleasantly through his own season, meaning nothing more by it than he means by similar warmth toward any of the half-dozen other young women he has danced with and corresponded with in more sanctioned ways across this same summer. She has watched over 2 seasons now more than one friend mistake a young man's general good manners for particular interest, and suffer for the misreading afterward, quietly in the particular contained way young women of her class were expected to suffer romantic disappointment, without visible complaint, without any outward sign that might suggest to watching society that she had in fact been hoping for rather more than she ultimately received. And yet the letters continue arriving, 4 of them now, each one carrying details that feel, to her careful reading, more specific, more genuinely attentive to who she actually is rather than who a young woman generically might be. Small references back to things she said weeks ago that suggest he was actually listening rather than merely performing attentiveness. And this evening's mention of the August house party, however carefully hedged, felt, she is fairly certain, like something real. She thinks too briefly before sleep finally takes her, about her aunt, about Evelina, whom she has always admired without ever quite examining what that admiration is actually built from, the particular competence and warmth with which Evelina runs this entire household, hosts 60 guests without apparent strain, manages a niece's courtship with a gentleness Louisa has noticed and been quietly grateful for, even when it has not been directly acknowledged between them. She wonders drowsily whether Evelina's own courtship, all those years ago, felt anything like this particular mixture of hope and careful self-doubt, and thinks she might ask her directly one day, though not yet, not while the outcome with Frederick remains this uncertain, since asking now would feel, somehow, like tempting a fate she is not yet ready to name aloud, even to the aunt who has been, in every practical sense, the closest thing to a mother she has known since she was a small child. She falls asleep with the letter still in her hand rather than return to its hiding place. A small carelessness Ivy will notice and quietly correct in the morning before anyone else is caused to see it, tucking it back beneath the false bottom of the writing box without comment, the way she has done for weeks now, a small daily act of loyalty that Louisa will thank her for eventually, in whatever form thanks eventually takes between a lady and the maid who has kept her secret this carefully for this long, at whatever quiet risk to her own position it has genuinely represented. There is a rhythm to the entire year that a household like Ashcombe follows, one that this single July day sits inside like a single bead on a long, familiar string, and it is worth understanding before we let this particular day finally close, because it explains why summer at the country house feels, to everyone living through it, like a kind of exhale after the considerably more pressured rhythm of the London season that has just concluded. The family's year divides broadly into 2 great movements: London for the season, roughly Easter through the end of July, and the country for the remainder, though the country portion itself divides further into its own smaller seasons, each with its own particular character and its own particular demands. Summer at Ashcombe, the season we have spent this entire day inside, is relatively relaxed by comparison with what will follow it, a time of garden parties and boating and the kind of unhurried entertaining we have watched unfold today, guests staying a night or 2, croquet on the lawn, the particular loose, sociable warmth of long summer evenings that do not require the same intensity of formal calendar management as the London season just concluded. But autumn brings a shift, and everyone in this household, family and servants alike, already feels its approach even now, in the middle of July, the way one feels a change in weather hours before it actually arrives. The shooting season begins in earnest come August, when grouse shooting opens on the moors further north, an occasion some of tonight's male guests will travel considerable distances to participate in, followed by partridge shooting on the estate's own land come September, an entertainment that will require its own enormous logistical operation. Gamekeepers who have spent the entire summer, in fact, quietly rearing and protecting the pheasant and partridge poults that will provide the autumn's sport. Beaters hired from the local village to drive birds toward the waiting guns. An entirely different category of household guest, arriving for entirely different purposes than today's garden party visitors. Charla's own gamekeeper, a taciturn, weathered man named Purbrick, who reports to Whitfield, the land agent, but operates with a considerable independence born of his own specialized expertise, has spent this entire summer managing exactly this preparation, protecting young birds from foxes and poachers alike, a genuine and sometimes dangerous responsibility since poaching, in this era, carried real economic stakes for poor families in the surrounding villages who saw in the estate's carefully protected game birds a meal their own tables badly needed, and a landowner's law that criminalized taking it, a tension that occasionally erupted into genuine confrontation between Purbrick and desperate local men, confrontations that Evelina and Charles rarely discuss directly at their own dinner table, but that both are perfectly aware form an uncomfortable undercurrent to the pleasant sport their autumn guests will eventually enjoy. September and October, once the shooting parties begin in earnest, will bring an entirely different rhythm to Ashcombe than the one we have watched today. Considerably more male guests, considerably more formal, ritualized entertainment built around the sport itself, and Evelina's own role during these months shifts accordingly, managing house parties that run to a week or more at a stretch, guests arriving with their own valets and ladies' maids who must themselves be accommodated within the servants' hall hierarchy, a considerably more complex hosting challenge than today's single afternoon and evening, one that Evelina is already, even now in mid-July, beginning to think ahead toward, mentally drafting menus and guest lists and room assignments for a season still 6 or 8 weeks distant. Winter, once the shooting season concludes, brings its own quieter rhythm. Christmas at Ashcombe with its own elaborate traditions, extended family gathering for a fortnight or more, the estate's tenants receiving their traditional gifts of beef and beer from the great house, a custom that Charles's family has maintained for generations and that carries, beneath its genuine generosity, its own quiet reinforcement of exactly the hierarchy we have spent this entire day examining. The great house giving, the tenant families receiving, gratitude expected, and generally, genuinely given in return. And then come the following spring, the entire cycle begins again, packing for London, the townhouse reopened after months shut up, servants who maintain the country house through the family's absence exchanging places, in some cases with servants who have been managing the empty London house, and the whole elaborate machinery of the season resuming, presentations and balls and the careful courtship calculations we watched play out today between Louisa and Frederick, a cycle that has repeated in its broad outlines for generations of families like this one, and that Charles and Evelina's own children, Henry and Cecily and small Arthur, will very likely grow up to inhabit in turn, inheriting not merely the house and the land but the entire intricate, largely unquestioned rhythm of a year built around exactly this alternation between the performance of the season and the deeper, slower breath of the country months, of which today this single long July day at Ashcombe has been one small, complete, and in its own way entirely representative example. There is a fitting scheduled for Thursday, mentioned briefly in this morning's correspondence, and it is worth pausing on, because the sheer economics of a wardrobe like Evelina's tend to surprise people considerably once the actual numbers are laid alongside them. Evelina's dressmaker, a Frenchwoman named Madame Aubry, who trained in Paris before setting up her own establishment in the county town some 15 years ago, produces perhaps a dozen major gowns for Evelina each year. Evening dresses, dinner dresses, walking dresses, garden dresses like the one she wore this afternoon. each one requiring several fittings, careful selection of fabric often ordered specifically from silk merchants in London or occasionally imported directly from France, and considerable hand labour in the actual construction, since sewing machines, while beginning to enter dressmaking establishments by this decade, were still used primarily for simpler seams, while the elaborate boning, draping, and trim work that distinguished a genuinely fashionable gown remained almost entirely the product of skilled hands working with needle and thread. A single evening gown of the quality Evelina wore to tonight's dinner might cost, in fabric and labour combined, a sum roughly equivalent to a full year's wages for one of her own housemaids, a fact that Evelina, to her credit, has occasionally allowed herself to sit with uncomfortably, though never quite long enough to translate that discomfort into any change of practice, since a woman of her position simply does not appear repeatedly in the same gown before the same social circle without inviting exactly the kind of quiet, damaging speculation about her household's finances that we discussed earlier this evening in connection with Lady Vane's new landau carriage. The economics of this go beyond simple vanity, and it is worth understanding why, because dress for a woman of Evelina's class functioned as a genuinely important form of communication, legible to everyone in her social circle in ways a modern observer might need to have carefully explained. The quality of fabric, the currency of the style, the skill of the construction, all of it signalled, instantly and wordlessly, a household's financial standing and by extension its social standing, and a hostess who allowed her wardrobe to grow visibly out of date risked a subtle but real erosion of her family's perceived position, regardless of whether the underlying finances had actually changed at all. Fashion itself moved at a pace that required this constant renewal, silhouettes shifting gradually but perceptibly from year to year. Sleeve shapes, skirt volumes, the particular cut of a bodice, all evolving in ways subtle enough that an untrained eye might miss them, but that every woman in Evelina's circle tracked with real attentiveness, since being even slightly behind the current fashion, wearing last year's sleeve shape this year, was its own small, visible signal that could not be entirely disguised no matter how expensive the original garment had been. Thursday's fitting concerns a new dinner dress that Evelina has been planning since the spring in anticipation of exactly the kind of entertaining she conducted tonight. A deep blue silk that Madame Aubrey sourced specially and that will require in total perhaps 3 fittings before it is finished, each one lasting the better part of an hour, Evelina standing while Madame Aubrey and her assistants pin and adjust and mark, a process that is, if we are honest about it, its own small variant of the same physical discipline the corset itself requires, standing still, patient, enduring minor physical discomfort for the sake of an eventual result that will serve precisely the same social function every other garment in Evelina's considerable wardrobe already serves. There is a whole economy beneath this too, worth mentioning, since Madame Aubrey's own establishment employs perhaps 8 seamstresses, young women who work long hours, often by candlelight or gaslight well into the evening during the busiest stretches of the social calendar, for wages considerably lower than what a lady's maid like Sarah earns, doing the actual detailed hand sewing that produces the gowns Evelina and women like her wear to garden parties and dinners across the county. These seamstresses' working conditions, the long hours, the strain on eyesight from close needlework done by inadequate light, the physical toll of sitting hunched over fine stitching for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch, were a subject of increasing public concern by this point in the century, occasionally raised in newspapers and even in Parliament, though the concern rarely translated into meaningful change for the women actually doing the work, and Evelina herself, standing for her fittings, thinking about her own domestic concerns, the fittings cost, whether the colour truly suits her, has genuinely never once asked Madame Aubrey a single question about the women whose hands will actually produce the garment she is being measured for. Not from callousness exactly, but from the same kind of practiced, comfortable inattention that allows so much of this entire world to function smoothly for those at its upper reaches, without ever requiring them to look too closely at what makes that smooth functioning possible. Her existing wardrobe, meanwhile, does not simply sit unused once a season's fashion has moved past it. Older gowns are frequently reworked rather than discarded entirely. A skilled dressmaker able to update an existing garment with new trim, an altered sleeve, a changed neckline, extending its useful life considerably beyond what the original purchase alone would suggest. And some of Evelina's older dresses, once she is finished with them entirely, are passed down eventually to Sarah or to other servants, a practice so common across households of this class that it formed a genuine, if modest, supplementary income for many ladies' maids, who could sell a cast-off silk gown to a second-hand clothes dealer for a sum that, while nothing compared to the original cost, still represented a meaningful addition to wages that were otherwise, as we discussed earlier, considerably lower than what the garment itself had originally cost to produce. Let us return gently to the subject of Evelina's letter, because understanding the broader medical world she is navigating helps explain why her particular caution, her use of an assumed name, her careful anonymous correspondence, made such complete sense within the world she actually inhabited, however strange it might look from a considerable distance. Medicine in this decade sat in a genuinely transitional position, no longer the wilder speculation of the previous century, but not yet possessed of the diagnostic tools, the germ theory fully established only recently and still working its way into general medical practice, the anesthesia now available for surgery but still carrying real risk. That would transform medical care within another generation or two. A physician examining a patient like Evelina, were she to see one in person, would rely overwhelmingly on what he could observe directly: pulse, colour, reported symptoms, physical examination where propriety allowed it. Since the blood tests, the imaging, the whole apparatus of modern diagnosis simply did not exist yet in any form Evelina or her physician would recognize. Women's health specifically occupied a particularly fraught corner of this medical world, shaped by ideas about female physiology that ranged from the genuinely useful to the actively harmful, often within the very same physician's practice. There was widespread belief, for instance, in a condition called hysteria, understood as originating, the very word derives from the Greek for womb, in some disorder of the female reproductive organs, and used as a catch-all diagnosis for an enormous range of symptoms, from genuine physical illness to what we would today recognize as anxiety or depression to, in some genuinely troubling cases, simple female assertiveness or discontent that a husband or father found inconvenient to have named as anything more legitimate than a nervous complaint, requiring quiet management rather than serious attention. Evelina is aware, in the vague, uneasy way most educated women of her class were aware, that raising any complaint involving her own reproductive health risked exactly this kind of dismissal. Being told, essentially, that her symptoms were nervous in origin, that rest and calm and perhaps a tonic of iron or quinine would resolve matters, without any serious investigation of what might actually be occurring physically. This is precisely why she sought out, through careful inquiry among a small circle of women she trusts, a physician with a specific reputation for taking women's reported symptoms seriously rather than reflexively attributing them to nerves. A reputation that, she has been told, sets him apart from a considerable number of his colleagues, and why she was willing to go to such lengths, the false name, the intermediary address, to consult him specifically rather than simply describing her symptoms to the family's own regular physician, a kindly, competent man named Dr. Ellery, who has treated this household for over a decade, but who Evelina suspects, based on comments he has made in passing over the years about other women's complaints, would likely reach for exactly the nervous diagnosis she is trying to avoid. There is a broader context worth understanding too, about how illness generally moved through a household like Ashcombe. Since Alice, the housemaid Mrs. Hartley, discussed sending for the doctor about this very morning, represents a considerably more common kind of medical concern than Evelina's own private worry. Most everyday illness within the household, colds, minor injuries, digestive upsets, was treated first with home remedies, a considerable body of practical knowledge that Mrs. Hartley herself maintains: willow bark for fever, ginger for stomach complaints, poultices for minor wounds and inflammations, knowledge passed down through generations of housekeepers and often recorded in a household recipe book that sits alongside the actual cooking recipes, since the line between medicine and cookery was, in practical domestic terms, considerably blurrier than it is today. Dr. Ellery is called in for anything more serious, and his visits follow their own social protocol, entering through the front door for consultations with the family, through the servant's entrance when his business concerns only the staff, a small architectural detail that nonetheless communicates quite clearly the household's own internal hierarchy, even in matters as ostensibly universal as illness and its treatment. His fees too reflect this stratification, charged at a considerably higher rate for treating the family than for treating servants, a two-tiered system of medical care that was entirely ordinary for its era, and that nobody within this household, family or servant alike, would have thought to question as anything other than the natural order of how such things worked. Serious illness, when it struck, carried a weight and a fear that modern medicine has largely, blessedly removed from most people's daily experience, since infectious disease in particular could move through a household or a village with a speed and lethality that made even minor symptoms, a persistent cough, an unexplained fever, sources of genuine alarm rather than the mild inconvenience such symptoms represent today. Evelina herself lost a child in infancy some years back, a fact we mentioned earlier, and one that sits, quietly, behind a great deal of her own private anxiety about the letter currently sitting in her writing desk drawer, since infant mortality, even among wealthy families with access to the best medical care their era could offer, remained tragically common throughout this period, a fact so woven into the ordinary experience of parenthood that most families of this era carried at least one such loss within their own history. Grief that was genuinely deeply felt and yet had to be borne, in public at least, with the same composed restraint that governed nearly every other emotional experience available to a woman in Evelina's position. Tomorrow will bring its own particular demands, since Charles's mother arrives on the 2:15 train, and Evelina will spend a good part of the morning preparing for a fortnight's visit she has been quietly dreading since March, and it is worth pausing here, near the end of this long day, to notice something about how completely one day folds into the next in a household like this one, how little space exists in practice between the closing of one performance and the opening of the next. There will be no real rest for Evelina tomorrow, not in any sense a modern person would recognize as rest, only a different configuration of the same essential demands, a different guest requiring a different kind of careful management, a mother-in-law whose visits carry their own particular weight, their own history of small comments about household management that Evelina has learned over 11 years to absorb with outward grace while noting privately, with considerable if entirely unexpressed irritation, exactly which of her own long-established household customs are about to be quietly, diplomatically questioned by a woman who ran this same house for over 2 decades before Evelina ever arrived in it. And yet, thinking about tomorrow honestly, in this quiet hour before sleep, Evelina finds she does not resent it. Not exactly, or not only. There is something in the sheer continuity of it. The fact that this house has run this way, guest following guest, season following season, correspondence answered and dresses fitted and children visited in their appointed hour, for generations before her, and will likely continue in largely the same shape for generations after, that she finds examined honestly, rather more comforting than burdensome, a structure large enough and old enough to hold her particular private worries, the letter in the drawer, the fear she has not yet named to Charles, without those worries ever threatening to overwhelm the structure itself. This is perhaps one of the genuine, complicated truths sitting underneath everything we have watched today. The truth that a life this constrained, this thoroughly scripted from the moment of waking to the moment of sleep, can nonetheless contain, held carefully within its own rigid architecture, genuine warmth, genuine pleasure, a piano practiced for the private joy of it rather than any audience, a boat ride on a lake at golden hour, a widow's dry, welcome honesty at a card table, a husband's quiet, genuine interest in a difficult legal case discussed over an ordinary dinner at home. The performance never fully stops, not for Evelina, not for Louisa, not in their own different registers, for Grimshaw or Mrs. Hartley or Sarah or even young Sam turning that ice cream churn this afternoon until his arm ached. And yet within the performance, threaded carefully through it, something genuinely human continues to live, love and worry and small private hope, and the particular specific pleasure of cool water on a summer evening. And perhaps this is simply what any life looks like, viewed closely enough, however different its outward shape from our own, a structure built by forces largely outside any single person's control, inhabited nonetheless by someone doing their genuine best to find whatever warmth and meaning that particular structure allows. Louisa's letter sits once more in its hidden compartment, returned there by Ivy sometime before dawn, and whatever comes of Frederick Annesley, whether August's house party brings the more formal understanding both young people are quietly hoping for, or whether, as happens more often than any 19-year-old wants to consider, the whole tentative thing simply does not come to pass, Louisa will have had at minimum this one particular July evening on the lake, the low gold light, the careful casual conversation about a novel that meant considerably more than its surface, a memory that will belong to her regardless of whatever her own future eventually holds. Evelina's health too remains genuinely uncertain tonight, the physician's letter offering reassurance without certainty, the London appointment still a plan rather than an accomplished fact, and there is no tidy resolution available to offer here, no way of knowing from where we sit tonight exactly what she will learn once she finally makes that journey and sits, nervous and carefully composed, in a stranger's consulting room some weeks from now. What we do know, what this entire long day has shown us, if it has shown us anything at all, is that she will meet whatever comes with the same quiet, largely invisible competence she has brought to everything else today. The corset laced tight through 14 hours of hosting, the seating chart calculated to the smallest degree of social precedence, the letters answered in exactly the correct register for each correspondent, because this is in the end what her entire life has trained her, thoroughly and completely to do, to carry weight without visibly bending under it, and whatever private cost that particular skill has exacted from her over the years, and it has clearly exacted a real one, she has never once, not today, not across 11 years of marriage, allowed that cost to show itself to anyone beyond the privacy of her own bedroom. In the last quiet hour before sleep, with a single candle burning low, and a letter folded carefully back along its original crease. There is one more small scene worth telling before we let this day finally close, because it happened very quietly, almost unnoticed, in the last hour before the guests departed this evening. And it says something true about this whole world, that the louder scenes, the garden party, the dinner, the choreography of precedence, do not quite capture on their own. Mrs. Fenwick gathering her shawl and preparing to be handed up into her own carriage for the short journey home, since she lives only a few miles distant and declined the invitation to stay over, paused for a moment beside Evelina on the front steps, the two of them briefly alone in the way that departures sometimes allow, the other guests already dispersed toward their own carriages, Grimshaw and the footman occupied elsewhere with luggage and farewells. She said, without any particular preamble, that she had buried a husband and outlived 2 sisters and raised 4 children of her own, 3 of whom survived her, and that in all that time, the thing she had learnt most thoroughly, more thoroughly than any lesson her own considerably stricter mother had ever tried to teach her, was that a woman in their position could carry almost anything, provided she did not try to carry it entirely alone for too long. She said this mildly, almost as an aside, patting Evelina's arm once, gently, before allowing a footman to hand her up into her carriage, and she gave no indication that she knew anything at all about the letter in the writing desk drawer upstairs. And yet Evelina, standing on the steps watching the carriage pull away down the darkening drive, felt, for reasons she could not entirely name, considerably less alone than she had felt at any other point across this long, carefully performed day. It is a small moment, easy to miss entirely if you are only watching the grander choreography of croquet and dinner courses and seating precedents, but it is in its own way exactly the kind of moment this whole story has been quietly built around. The brief instant when the performance eases just slightly and something more honest passes between two people who have spent an entire lifetime, each in her own way learning precisely how much of themselves it is safe to show. Evelina will remember it tomorrow, and likely for considerably longer than that, long after she has forgotten the specific arrangement of tonight's seating chart, or the particular shade of Lady Vane's new landau carriage. She will not act on it immediately, not tell Mrs. Fenwick the truth of what she is actually carrying. Not yet, perhaps not for months yet, if ever fully, but she will carry the sentence itself forward, quietly, the way one carries any small, unexpected kindness offered at exactly the right moment, and it will sit, gently, alongside the letter in her drawer, another small private thing folded away for whenever she next has need of it. It is past 1 in the morning now at Ashcombe Park, and the house has gone fully deeply quiet in the way old houses do, a quiet that is not really silence at all if you listen closely, but a low, settled hum of small sounds, a beam somewhere contracting as the day's heat finally releases from the stone, the faint creak of the front door as the last cool air of the night finds its way through some gap Grimshaw's careful locking up did not quite manage to seal, an owl calling once, twice, from somewhere down near the lake where, only hours ago, a young man rowed a small boat across gold water while a girl trailed her fingers through the surface and said nothing at all about what she was actually feeling. Charles came up not long after Evelina finally blew out her candle, and he is asleep now, in the deep, uncomplicated way of a man whose day, however busy, carried none of the particular hidden weight his wife's did, and Evelina lies beside him listening to his breathing settle into its familiar rhythm, and finds herself at last growing properly tired herself, the specific held tension of the day, the corset's absence now finally registering in her body as pure relief rather than merely the cessation of pain, beginning to loosen its grip on her shoulders, her jaw, the small muscles around her eyes that have held a hostess's pleasant, attentive expression for something like 16 hours running. Downstairs, in the housekeeper's room, Mrs. Hartley's keys hang on their hook by the door, 30 of them, silent now until morning, when she will rise before 6, as she always does, to begin the whole careful architecture again, though tomorrow's architecture will look, in its details, somewhat different from today's, since a mother-in-law's fortnight visit requires its own particular calibration of menus and room preparation that Mrs. Hartley has already in fact begun quietly planning in the back of her mind, even while managing everything this single long day required. In the attic, the housemaids sleep on in their shared, still warm rooms, 4 young women whose names, Dora and Susan among them, we mentioned only briefly this evening in connection with a small ongoing rivalry over a shared fondness for an undergardener, a rivalry that will resume tomorrow exactly where it left off today, as these small human dramas always do, regardless of how grand or how humble the house around them happens to be. Peggy sleeps too in her small shared room off the kitchen passage, her hands, scrubbed raw again this evening after a long day's work, finally at rest, and in something less than 4 hours she will rise again in the dark, to begin the exact same morning we watched unfold at the very start of this story, the range to be black-leaded, the kitchen to be readied, the whole enormous machinery of this household's daily life beginning its next slow turn, before almost anyone else in the house has even opened their eyes. Young Sam sleeps soundly, his arm no longer aching from this afternoon's ice cream churning, and somewhere in his dreams, if dreams come to a boy this thoroughly worn out by physical labour, there is perhaps nothing more remarkable than the ordinary undirected drift of a 13-year-old's rest, though Mrs. Hartley, we mentioned, has begun quietly wondering whether there might be more waiting for him eventually than hallboy's work, a small private hope she has not yet mentioned to anyone, including, for now, Sam himself. In the stable block, Barrett and the grooms are long asleep, the 11 horses settled and quiet in their stalls, the carriages cleaned and ready in the coach house for whatever tomorrow's calendar, the 2:15 train and the mother-in-law it will bring happens to require of them next. Louisa sleeps too, finally, the letter safely returned by Ivy to its hidden compartment sometime in these small hours, and whatever tomorrow holds for her, whatever August eventually brings in the way of a formal understanding or, just as possibly, a quiet disappointment, she will have to learn to carry with the same composed grace her aunt has modelled for her across this entire long day. Tonight at least, she sleeps with the particular light, hopeful heart of 19, a boat and a lake and a conversation about a novel still warm in her memory, unresolved, genuinely open, exactly the way the very best and most honest moments in a life so carefully scripted in every other respect are sometimes allowed briefly to remain. And Evelina finally drifts towards sleep herself. The decision made about the letter, the physician, the careful arrangements still to come, the fear she named to herself so honestly earlier this evening, neither fully resolved nor fully denied, but simply for tonight, set down, the way one sets down any weight one has been carrying too long, without quite noticing the accumulated strain of it. She thinks in the last clear moment before sleep finally takes her, of the passage in her worn copy of Middlemarch, the one about a woman looking out a window at a life both entirely full and strangely circumscribed. The page softened now at its corner from all the times her thumb has returned to it, and she thinks, not for the first time and probably not for the last, that she understands that passage rather better than she once did, and that understanding it does not in the end change very much about what tomorrow will require of her, and that this too, strange as it sounds, is a kind of peace, the peace of a woman who has stopped expecting her circumstances to change, and has found instead within those unchanged circumstances a way to keep some small private portion of herself intact, folded away carefully like a letter in a drawer, for whenever she has need of it. This is what a single day at a house like Ashcombe actually contained, if you looked closely enough at every room and every hour of it. Not simply croquet on a lawn and strawberries under a striped awning, though it contained those too, not simply a butler's careful selection of wine, or a housekeeper's 30 keys, or a scullery maid's blackened hands, though it contained all of that as well. It contained a courtship conducted almost entirely in the gaps between what could be properly said aloud. It contained a fear carried alone, in silence, by a woman whose entire life had trained her never to ask for help until she had first exhausted every possibility of managing alone. It contained rivalries dressed as friendship and friendship, in Mrs. Fenwick's case at least, dressed as nothing more than a widow's dry honesty at a card table. It contained an entire invisible household of servants whose labour made every single visible pleasure of the day possible, and whose own private hopes and rivalries and small daily satisfactions ran on, largely unseen, beneath the family's own more visible story, every bit as real, every bit as complicated, simply never quite illuminated by the same light. If you have made it this far tonight, and I suspect, given the hour, you are somewhere close to sleep yourself, wherever you happen to be watching from, whatever room and whatever city holds you right now, I hope something in this long, slow day at Ashcombe Park has settled somewhere in you the way I always hope these stories do. Not a lesson exactly, nothing so tidy as that, just the sense, perhaps, that every ordinary day, however grand or however humble the house around it, holds considerably more inside it than anyone standing at the surface could ever guess. Courtships and fears and small rebellions, gooseberries turning to preserve in a copper pan, an owl calling from the direction of a lake that was dug by hand 100 years before, a girl at a window before dawn wondering about a life that was not her own, and a woman finally in the deepest hour of the night, folding a single private fear back into its drawer and allowing herself at last to rest. The candle in Evelina's room has long since gone out. The house around her breathes its slow, settled summer breath, stone cooling, timber easing, the last of the day's warmth finally gently releasing into the dark. Somewhere below, The coals in the kitchen range sit banked under their careful layer of ash, waiting for morning. Somewhere beyond the walls, the lake lies flat and dark and undisturbed, holding, for tonight at least, no more of anyone's stories, only the quiet reflection of a sky beginning, very slowly, very gently, to lighten toward another day. Sleep now if you have not already drifted there yourself. There is nothing more required of you tonight. No letter to answer, no dress to be laced, no seating chart to calculate. Just this house, this lake, this long summer night, gathering itself quietly around you and holding you gently until morning. Somewhere in the dark beyond the park's old stone wall, the village itself has long since gone to sleep as well, the same village whose church holds the family's pew of 4 generations, whose cottages Evelina visits twice a month with baskets that are never quite called charity, whose men have spent this same summer quietly aware, in the way Purbrick the gamekeeper is aware, of exactly how carefully the estate's abundance is being protected against exactly the kind of need that abundance itself so often creates in the fields and lanes just beyond its walls. Tonight, at least, none of that tension is awake either. Only the dark fields, the sleeping cottages, the same low quiet hum of a summer night settling over every house in this small corner of the county, grand or humble alike, each one holding its own version of the day we have just spent together, each one in its own way finally at rest. The last candle in the house has gone out now. Even the single lamp Grimshaw kept burning low in the front hall through the evening has been extinguished, the wick pinched between careful fingers before he too finally climbed the back stairs to his own quiet room. Ashcombe Park stands dark against a sky that will not properly lighten for several hours yet, its 41 rooms holding their sleeping household the way they have held every household that has passed through them for generations, and will hold in all likelihood for generations still to come. Rest now. The morning, when it arrives, will bring its own new day entirely, but that is a story for another night.